Helen, are you at it again? What kids? We're always at work. And then, how do you imagine that here we have someone will appear, nipples, nappies, snot? You'll be unhappy later, Travis said irritably, folding his snow-white shirt and trousers neatly into his traveling bag. His wife was walking around the flat in a pink silk dressing gown with a small, dainty watering can in her hands, watering her favorite orchids. She had several dozen of them, and almost all of them were in bright colors. Travis, you're forgetting. I'm about to turn 32, she replied from the other room. Who cares about age? I've got you looking in your early 20s, and medicine has moved on a long time ago. People are having babies at a ripe old age now, too. Let's postpone the question of children for a while, her husband asked with a strained smile, looking at the beautiful, slender woman who had entered the room. Okay, but promise me that next year we'll definitely think about it, Helen asked hopefully, snuggling up to him. He reluctantly hugged her and glanced hurriedly at his watch. Oh, I've got to run already. If I can get to the airport in at least an hour, it'll be a great success. I'll fire this new secretary. That's right, the second time she buys a ticket and at the most inconvenient time. They said goodbye quickly. Travis left, and the flat became quiet and empty. Helen went to the window and stared out at the busy street for a long time. Dusk was falling, hundreds of cars were rolling down the road, and lights were on in the windows of the houses. The feeling of loneliness had haunted her too often in recent months. It was unbearable to be alone in the evenings. Of course, a lot of time was spent on work. It was not easy to run a big firm after all. But since she decided to do her own thing, it had been 5 years the team had been formed. There were reliable deputies, so there was no need to work round the clock. One of the branches was headed by her husband, and she trusted him completely. Travis was always away once a month, and that's understandable. At first, Helen traveled around the country to meet with customers, sign contracts, and supervise the work of contractors. It seemed that nothing would work without the personal involvement of the manager. Now that she has more freedom, she is more and more often visited by the desire to have a child. She has money and connections. She owns 2 spacious flats, a large country house and a car, has a stable income, decent bank accounts. She can provide her children with everything, put them in the best school, take them to the sea, on holiday, every month to buy the best quality clothes. Secretly from her husband, Helen began to go into the children's departments and shopping centers. She admired tiny things, looked at toys. She envied women walking with prams. A special hobby of hers was going to visit her friends who had already given birth. Sit for an hour and go. It's still nothing, told her once one of the happy owners of the status of twice mum. It's the days when they're teething, or when they have to put together a pinecone craft at 1 a.m. That's the best. But you'd still have them, wouldn't you, even if you could go back now? Helen inquired. No way, replied her friend with a laugh. The evening, as expected, dragged on long and agonizingly. As Helen fell asleep, she thought about how great it would be to get pregnant this year, despite her husband's protests. Travis would surely be happy and forget all his arguments. There's no doubt about it. How could it be any other way? I didn't sleep well. Every now and then I woke up and looked at the clock. When morning came and the alarm clock rang, I realized that my head hurt as if I hadn't slept at all. Without desire, I had breakfast, chose an outfit and hairstyle, and drove to work. Parking outside the office, Helen gracefully stepped out of the car and headed towards the huge mirrored building of the business center. Taking her phone out of her handbag, she began to read the messages that had already arrived in the morning, at least 100 of them, in the endless work chats. Excuse me, some man addressed her timidly from behind. Helen didn't hear, and he followed her out. Young lady, wait. In front of her stood a ragged, dirty man in his 40s with a boy in his arms. It was obvious that being next to a smartly dressed woman in a bright blue suit and shining jewelry, with impeccable makeup and an obviously unfriendly appearance, he was uncomfortable and even scared. Helen looked at the tramp in surprise, clearly not understanding what he wanted. Her thoughts were flowing sluggishly after a sleepless night, and everything was highly irritating. "What?" she asked coldly. "You dropped your wallet when you got out of the car. Here, take it." He handed her a burgundy leather wallet with gold lettering and hurriedly stepped aside. "Thank you," Helen extended slowly. She turned away at first, and the man heard her heels clacking behind her, but quickly stopped. "What's wrong with your baby?" she asked. "I don't know," the unpleasant stranger shrugged. "Maybe he's got a cold. Very weak, can't walk." She glanced at the boy. He did indeed seem sick and weakened. He looked about 5 years old. He had a thin face, a confused and sad look on his face, his arms dangling lifelessly. Helen felt madly sorry for him. "Take him to the hospital and get some medicine," she advised. "They won't take us to the hospital. No papers, they say." The man sighed and became embarrassed again as he saw the businesswoman approaching him. Helen took another closer look at the child and he looked up at her. The boy's blonde curls peeked out from under a striped cap. His knees were stained with sand, and his left shoe was torn. The boy coughed loudly and hid his face in the jacket of a man who appeared to be his father. "And where do you live?" she asked, already with interest. "Wherever I have to," the tramp explained. In spite of the wretched, worn clothes and tired face, he did not arouse a feeling of disgust. On the contrary, he seemed to be a very intelligent man who for some reason had disguised himself as a beggar. A few books were visible from his rucksack with a broken lock, and a gold watch on a leather strap peeped out from under the sleeve of his jacket, clearly not cheap, though it was quite old. Here, Helen pulled a few paper notes out of her purse and held them out. "Buy your son some medicine." "I can't give it back," her interlocutor shook his head. "And I'm not you. It's for the child," she insisted. "I have the watch. Kept it as a memento." The man looked at his treasure. "I think they'll accept it at the pawn shop. We'll buy what we need then. Sorry to have bothered you." The man was about to go on his way, and Helen's mind was frantically whirling with thoughts of letting her into the office, giving her money for a hostel, calling people she knew, and finding shelter. "All right," Helen said firmly. "I'll take your watch for safekeeping. When you can, buy it back. For now, take the money. And here are also the keys to my summer house. There's nothing to steal there except furniture, but I don't think you'll need it. You can stay there for a few days until the boy recovers." The man looked hopefully at the child, sighed, and took the keys. "Thank you," he said. "We won't take anything, I swear." Helen, meanwhile, was quickly writing her address and telephone number on a check she could find in her bag. Here, she held out the sheet. "The big key is for the gate, the middle one for the front door. The water and gas are cut off, but I think you'll find a way to switch it on. Call if you need anything." With that, they said goodbye, and Helen walked briskly to the office. Stepping into the lift and looking at her reflection in the mirror, she caught herself thinking, "What's all this for? Don't you have enough problems of your own?" "You're crazy." Her friend Cynthia reacted to her story as they drank coffee at lunchtime. "The walls will be all that's left. That's the best case scenario. But why are you being so forward? It doesn't strike me as some kind of fraud at all." "Oh, you'd think crooks would have it written all over their foreheads." Cynthia was not reassured. In fact, Helen was sorry too for having acted so rashly, though she was accustomed to act in a measured and practical manner. Why would she help some homeless person anyway? On the other hand, she really did it for the sake of the child. That thought made her feel better. As she drove home, trying to beat the traditional evening traffic jam in the center, there was no longer any doubt that she had done the right thing. Travis wouldn't understand her, of course, but he could always be reasoned with. In fact, she didn't even have to tell him, especially since they hadn't been to the cottage since last year. "You're too kind." A thought ran through her head, voiced by her husband's voice, and she smiled. While Helen was wheeling through the city streets, dealing with work issues on the phone and booking a hotel for New Year's Eve, Travis was on the road too. He was speeding along the country motorway towards the cottage, holding the steering wheel with one hand. The other rested on the knee of a slender young girl. "What should I cook for you tonight?" He looked at his companion lovingly. Something unusual, replied the latter lazily. Leaning back in her chair, she ran her hand through her long red hair and clapped her huge eyelashes. My beauty. Travis looked her over. Okay, we'll stop at the shop on the way, and you'll have the best dinner of your life tonight. And breakfast and breakfast and breakfast and breakfast. The home-cooked dinner was soon canceled. There was a cozy restaurant in the village where the couple spent their evening. The car was parked there. They walked to the cottage, staggering slightly and laughing loudly. Travis, said the girl, trying to be serious, tell me. Yeah, the man responded. If it weren't for your wife, would you marry me? Sure, replied Travis, clumsily opening the door. Well, yeah, right, the mistress took offense, and then added loudly, you lie, Travis. And I'm prettier than your wife, and smarter. And you're not getting married, and I'm not going anywhere with you. Almost a whole day had passed since Helen had handed the keys to the tramp with the child, and the man had already made himself comfortable in the house, buying medicine and food. He took the boy out of town by train, helped him wash, fed him, gave him his pills, and put him to bed on the first floor. After that, he started the car with all their things and went to the bathroom himself. When he came out, he was very pleased, because he felt human for the first time in weeks, clean, shaven, happy. He looked much better. For 15 minutes he had been watching from the window as a stranger tried to drag a woman into the gates of the house. She resisted at first, shouting at him and waving him off. Then they made up, hugged, and laughter came from the street. Now the couple was heading straight for the door. The accidental guest stood in the kitchen, wondering whether he should go upstairs or meet them in the hallway. There was no way he could have expected his hosts to arrive so soon. What if that woman just changed her mind and is about to kick them out the door? The clothes are still damp, and it wouldn't do the boy any good to be outside in them. What's the solution? Morally preparing to go pack, the man remained standing where he was. The couple piled noisily inside, scattering their belongings. They headed into the living room, but then Travis looked away, meeting the stranger's eyes. Oh, who the hell is that? Startled, the mistress asked ringingly. Gwen, go over there and wait for me on the sofa. Travis nudged her towards the large room on the ground floor without looking and headed smugly into the kitchen. Did you climb in here through the window? No, the guest replied calmly. All right then, you get out of here now, and I'm not calling the police. Come on, hurry up. I don't have time for this right now, Travis ordered, stretching his words and waving his hand towards the door. He pointed impatiently at the door, but for some reason the uninvited guest continued to stand still. Gwen peeked out from behind the door and asked capriciously, What's the matter? How long do I have to wait? I'll be right there. Sit tight for a while, Travis said. You're annoying, she replied. Get out now. I'm not a thief, the man said calmly again. A woman gave me the keys today. Helen? I don't know her name. We met by chance. I found her purse. She offered to stay for a few days. I have a sick kid here. Travis stared dumbly at his guest, trying to think of anything. Apparently, he was having a hard time doing so. Then it seemed to hit him. He turned round, checking to see if Gwen was watching them, and when he was sure she wasn't around, he closed the door and spoke in a low voice, as if telling a secret. A woman, that tall, brunette, businesslike, wearing a blue suit, heels. And where did you meet? Downtown on Main Street near the new Mirror building. Maybe you're just winding me up. Maybe you're a lover? Angry Travis hissed. Yeah, I don't even know her name, the guest reminded with a smile. Okay, anyway, here's the deal. I'm here with a girl tonight. Let's make a deal. You stay and I don't report her to the police. But not a word to Helen about what you saw, okay? The tramp hesitated. He didn't want to deceive the woman who had helped them so much. But the image of being taken away by the police in damp clothes, even if the man would just kick them out of here, immediately came to mind. To find oneself on the street in autumn with a sick child is very scary. This they had already lived through in the last few days. After all, who is he to interfere in someone's private life? No one will even ask him, thought the tramp. All right, I agree, he finally replied. That's it then. Look, if you blab, I'll have you locked up. There are cameras here, so with that he finished and went to get Gwen up, who had already fallen asleep on the sofa in the living room. Confused, she stomped after Travis. The door slammed, followed by the woman's indignation, but soon the voices died down and there was silence. The boy slept soundly with his blanket pressed against him. He had had enough lately, so tired that even the loud voices downstairs did not wake him. The man lay down next to him for a few minutes. He looked up at the ceiling, wondering if he had done the right thing in promising not to tell Helen that her husband was cheating on her. Coming to the same thought, he calmed down and fell asleep. The next day, Helen was anxious and nervous from the morning. She had already called her husband 20 times, but he either didn't answer or was out of range. Something extraordinary had to have happened for him to behave this way. "Hold on," Helen turned to her husband's secretary, Maggie. "I can't get through to Mr. Tavis. Do you know what happened there?" "He promised to return from a business trip this morning. He's been delayed." The girl replied with a shrug of her shoulders and added with a condescending smile, "It happens." When Helen walked out of the office without getting any response, Maggie immediately dialed someone on the office phone. Can you believe she still doesn't know? Who the hell is Mrs. Helen? The whole office knows, and she's just a naive fool. I pity her. However, they didn't have to wait long. Travis called and reported that he was fine. The clients were difficult. It took a long time to discuss the terms of the contract, to explain literally every clause, and to prove that it would take exactly that amount of money, and no less to build the bridge. Helen exhaled. It was silly to raise such a panic. Come on, her husband was already waiting for her at home. So everything was fine then. "What's wrong? Are you ill?" she asked when she saw him lying on the bed with a compressive rolled-up towel on his forehead. "Oh no," he explained. "The motel pillows are so uncomfortable. I didn't get any sleep at all, and my head hurts." "In a motel?" came a surprised voice from the other room. "Well, yes," replied her husband, trying to think of a more realistic version. "We were traveling to the site, and in order to go there again the next day, we spent the night in the nearest village. We couldn't find anything better there." On Sunday, Helen had a full day off. She had already started to look for theater tickets, but at the construction site where Travis' team was working, a worker fell from the roof, and the director rushed there to solve the problem, and his wife decided to go to the cottage and see if everything is in order. All the more so because her friend Cynthia had already promised her that the walls would not catch her. Meeting at the door, Helen and her yesterday's casual acquaintance hardly recognized each other. The man had become the least like a tramp, cleanly dressed, combed, shaved. He seemed much more attractive and youthful, and he felt more confident. Helen, too, looked very different from yesterday in jeans, trainers, a hooded sweatshirt, and a bundle on her head instead of a sleek hairdo. "So how are you guys doing?" She started the conversation as she made her way inside. "I'm fine," the man replied, stretching his words, still contemplating whether to tell her about her husband's evening visit. "My name is Alex." "And I'm Helen. How's your boy?" "Noticeably better. I bought some medicine. His fever's down and he slept through the night." The boy did get better. He cheered up and amused himself by making aeroplanes out of newspaper pages and flying them around the room. "So how did you and your son end up on the street?" Helen asked directly, sitting down with a cup of coffee at the kitchen table. "Actually," Alex hesitated, "he's not my son. I found him and couldn't leave him." "Found where?" Helen wondered. "In the woods. I was living in a derelict house on the outskirts at the time, went to pick mushrooms. And there he was, dressed all right, but frightened out of his wits, huddled under a tree and shivering. I thought he would calm down and tell me what had happened to him, but he kept silent. And so we wandered together until autumn. Now it's raining at night. It's cold, he's sick. Thank you for taking him in. As soon as he's well enough, we'll leave." "Why didn't you go to the police?" Helen continued to ask. Her interlocutor hesitated for some reason and began fumbling with a kitchen towel. "I was afraid to go to the police. People like me don't want to get involved. They'll think I stole it or something." "What do you plan to do with him?" Maybe he'll talk, we'll wander till winter, and then I'll bring him to some shelter. He can't survive the cold outside." She nodded understandingly. Helen was dumbfounded by the story she had heard. It all sounded very strange and even kind of wild. A boy was wandering alone in the woods. He was found by a man of no fixed abode, and now the two of them are wandering around the city. "Can I talk to him?" Helen asked after a long pause. "Yes, if you want," Alex replied, shrugging his shoulders. Together they went upstairs. The boy, seeing the stranger, quickly climbed onto the bed, hiding under the covers. "Hi," Helen said a friendly hello. "I won't hurt you. Don't be afraid." She'd brought a colorful bag from a stationery shop she'd managed to stop at on the way. There was nothing else, so she bought a sketchbook, coloring books, a few books, felt-tip pens, pencils and stickers, things that, in her unprofessional opinion, a 5-year-old should enjoy. She also bought fruit, juices and nuts. It was only when she wandered between the supermarket shelves that she realized she didn't know what to feed her children. "And I'm going to have my own," she said ironically. When she heard rustling, the boy moved. A lock of brown hair emerged from under the blanket, followed by 2 curious blue eyes. Helen realized the tactic was working and continued. "I brought you some presents. There's some books and coloring books with stickers. Do you want to draw?" The child looked with interest at the multicolored objects spread out on the table, then cautiously looked at the woman who had come to him, hesitated, as if assessing her. "Don't be afraid. Let's draw together. It's probably been a long time since you've drawn anything." The boy shook his head in agreement, carefully got off the bed, came to the table, sat down, pulled up a chair, and his eyes lit up. It had been so long since the poor man had seen anything that children loved. Those toys they found were inconvenient to carry around and had to be left behind. The one thing that was always with him was a little stuffed bunny with a carrot in his paws. "I brought it for you after the laundry." Alex held it out to him. The overjoyed boy took the toy and sat it on the table, as if to show off what they had brought. Helen smiled. The child answered her in kind. She opened her sketchbook, pulled out her pencils. "Draw something." "Eng." The boy nodded his head and began to draw. Helen and Alex looked at each other and started talking about what medicines they should take to get better. "We need to wash and cut up the fruit," Helen faltered, and they went out, leaving the boy alone. 15 minutes later, they returned with 2 large plates on which were visible pieces of all sorts of fruit: bananas, apples, apricots, pears, melon, and an equal variety of nuts. The boy happily took to eating the treats. Helen sat down at the table and began to look at the drawings. Alex stood behind her and also looked with interest at a few unsavory sketches on 2 sheets of paper. A little boy in a cape in the corner, and on the second sheet he, too, hiding under something that looked like a bed. On top is a red-haired woman, arms thrown up, mouth open as if she were screaming, and huge round eyes bulging. In one of the drawings, a similar woman is crossed out several times in black. Also something that looked like a sandbox with shovels and buckets. Candy. Helen looked round. Alex looked at her perplexed. And then, instead of taking in the meaning of the pictures, she wondered, "Who on earth are you?" flashed through her mind as they walked downstairs. Helen was about to leave and finally decided to ask. "Alex, you don't look like an alcoholic or worse. What happened? Why did you end up on the street?" He shook his head in response, making it clear he wasn't ready to share that. Helen understood and turned her attention to domestic matters. "You have enough food for now. If you need anything, you call me. You have a phone, don't you?" "Yes, I do," Alex replied, looking at the old button machine lying on the shelf. "Great. I'll see you then." Helen, wait. He stopped her, having probably decided to tell her about yesterday's visit after all, but again failing to gather his wits. He said, "Thank you so much for what you do for us. It's the little things." "I haven't done any of that yet," she smiled back. On the way back, Helen, as expected, got caught in traffic. What's with the daily evening tradition? I should switch to the underground, she thought in her heart, and dialed Travis. Travis, how's it going in there? Did it get resolved? Her husband was indignant on the phone about how clueless his employees were about not following basic safety rules. I'll be responsible for them now. Not a scratch on him. He fell from a small height onto the sand, luckily. But there are a lot of problems now. Don't wait until 10 o'clock. She felt like cheering him on. They talked some more, and as they passed out, she thought contentedly about how wonderful Travis was after all, and how lucky she was to have him. The evening passed alone again, though it didn't feel like it. On the contrary, she wanted to think about what to do in the circumstances. I wanted to help at least the child, but how to do it as carefully as possible was yet to be realized. Helen waited for the courier, who brought them a few days' worth of food on Sundays. There wasn't enough time to do it herself. They usually had breakfast in the business center cafe, lunch with clients in the restaurant or in the same cafe, but dinners were ordered and stored in the fridge. But today they didn't feel like eating. Helen put the containers away, made herself a cup of tea, and, sitting down with her laptop on her lap, began to look for information about children who had gone missing in the last year, without finding a single clue. She turned to psychology websites to try to figure out what all those drawings meant. The only thing that became obvious to her was that the boy wasn't being looked for. And if they were, they didn't post that information on the internet, or they posted it in some small communities. And then there's the pictures, the silence. He was clearly stressed, and there was something wrong with his family, if he had one. The next few weeks passed in reflection. Attempts to find out the baby's name were fortunately successful. Calling all the names in succession, Helen asked him to shake his head. At one point she thought they were wasting time, and the baby had simply forgotten his name. But he nodded contentedly when Helen said, "Michael. So we have you, Michael?" queried the woman contentedly, to which the happy name-bearer smiled. That was good. Through her connections, Helen tried to find out where Michael might have come from, but she was unsuccessful. An official inquiry was needed. A month later, she no longer imagined that she would just let them go out like she had planned the day she handed over the keys. Alex had taken a job as a stoker in the same village. So a lot of their time was now spent in the organization's lounge. But Helen insisted they should still live at the dacha because it is much more comfortable there. So that the man would not worry, she explained that she and her husband did not have time to go there, and in winter the house freezes, so keeping it at a normal temperature and cleanliness is very important. They were going to hire a caretaker anyway, and this way it was a double benefit. "You know, Alex, I wanted to talk to you," Helen hesitantly started the conversation on one of her visits. They were sitting in the living room while the boy raced around the ground floor on his brand new scooter. "I want to adopt Michael." Alex looked at her carefully and fell silent. This decision both pleased and upset him. On the one hand, Michael would finally have a family, and such a well-off one at that. Kindergarten, school clubs, he would have the best of everything, and there was no doubt about it. It's just the limit of desires. Well, not to wander with a strange homeless man on the city streets all his life. On the other hand, there's something Helen doesn't know. And there's something he, Alex, hasn't told her yet. I didn't want to be the person to hurt her. And it was a bit scary to meddle in the private affairs of such serious people. After all, who was he? "I'm very glad," he finally replied, and added cautiously, "Your husband won't object to the adoption." "Of course not," the naive woman reported cheerfully. "He will certainly take it seriously. Ask a lot of questions, but in the end he will agree." The conversation was postponed until Friday evening. On that day, the couple traveled to work in the same car and returned together. Although Helen was sure of her lover's nobility, her excitement was still growing. She couldn't stand it and said, stopping at a traffic light, "Travis, would you be willing to adopt a child?" "What?" The man didn't understand. "I'm saying, how would you feel about you and me adopting a boy?" "What's that for? What boy?" "His name is Michael." "Did something happen to him?" "He ended up on the streets, and now he's not talking. I think he could be helped by finding a good counselor. Besides, I don't get it. You decided something behind my back there, and now you want to put me on the spot." Travis interrupted her. clearly annoyed. "I haven't decided anything yet," Helen replied, trying to keep her tone friendly. "That's exactly what I want to consult with you." "I can see how you need my advice," he replied coldly. "But tell me, why do you want this strange child? Where did you dig him up from in the first place?" "It was an accident," Helen tried to explain. But Travis was so annoyed that he was in no condition to talk any further. "If you're still interested in my opinion, I'm strongly against it," he almost shouted. And Helen, too, went on the defensive. "Firstly, there's no need to talk to me like that," she began confidently as she pulled into the underground car park, and continued as the two of them headed for the lift. "I don't understand why you're so angry about all this." "Why pissed off?" "Helen, we've had this discussion many times. Neither you nor I care about children right now, much less adopted ones," her husband explained more calmly. "What could children possibly interfere with that? How do you know who he'll grow up to be? Maybe his parents are alcoholics or criminals." "So you're against it?" Deciding to summarize, Helen asked, opening the door to the flat. "I'm more than against it," her husband replied firmly and threw his shoes on the shelf with annoyance. She decided to put this conversation off for later, and generally regretted very much starting it in the car after a hard day's work. How else is he going to react when he's really tired and frustrated from the problems he's had? She mentally excused her husband. However, his reaction did not change her desire to participate in the fate of the child. Visits to offices and conversations with police officers allowed to learn the most important thing: Michael is looking for stepmother. The next day, Helen promised to bring the child to meet his relatives. Entering the office by the hand with his savior, Michael turned sharply to the door and wanted to run out when he was not allowed to do so. He scrambled into a corner and began to whimper, clutching his favorite bunny to his chest. Helen tried to lift the child, but he threw a tantrum and even cried aloud for the first time, though he did not utter a word. With difficulty, she managed to get him out of the shelter and put him in a chair. Helen held his hand and promised that she would not let anyone hurt him. At last, she was able to get a proper look at the woman who introduced herself as Michael's stepmother. She was a rather young red-headed beauty in a fur coat, with a heavily painted face and long red fingernails. Next to her sat a fat boy of about 7, grinning and looking at Michael, who was not himself. He sat with his eyes downcast and kept going over his toy in his hands. When questioned by the police officer, the stepmother tiredly explained that Michael's father had died a few months ago, after which the child stopped talking and allegedly started behaving inappropriately. "I tried to communicate with him, but he's like a wild animal," the stepmother recounted with obvious disgust. "Ran off somewhere. We looked for him. All the department, all the hospitals called. Well, I'll keep a closer eye on him now. Can we go now?" "No, we have to sign the papers first," the woman behind the desk said in a mundane tone. "Wait a minute," Helen interjected. "Can't you see that Michael doesn't want to go with them? He was a jolly boy before we came into the office. Do you want to go home with your stepmother and brother?" The female employee asked just as simply, turning in her chair towards Michael. He desperately shook his head and squirmed even more, as if he wanted to hide his head completely in his jacket. "What's there to listen to him for?" The redhead was indignant. "He'll go, that's all." Helen suddenly felt her maternal instinct awakening in her. She looked at the insolent girl standing in front of her with a stern look. "Michael, did that woman hurt you?" Sitting down, she turned to the boy huddled in the chair. He nodded timidly, then suddenly jumped off the chair and clung to her. Helen instinctively hugged him tightly in return. "What on earth is that? She's turning him against me. Don't you see?" Capriciously indignant was the lady in the coat. "Gwen, I don't think a child can be so set against anyone as to be backed into a corner," the staff member informed her after a moment's thought. "The child will go to boarding school, and who he stays with will be decided by the court. I think that's the best thing to do." Helen spent the next few weeks traveling constantly. Work temporarily took a back seat. She had to find a solicitor, interview neighbors, and arrange for them to attend the trial as witnesses. Her fears were confirmed with each new conversation. The stepmother and her son were apparently abusing Michael. That's why he had run away from them. "I saw her leave him in the playground until the evening. She'd take hers away, but she'd leave Michael. His grandmother from that flat on the ground floor used to take him out to eat. I'd give him something to eat if I got home from work at the same time. We even went to see her, 5 of us, but she sent us away. She said, "It's my child, I know how to bring him up." And she also said something about him being angry with her out of the blue, and that she was not hired as a nanny. All in all, she was very unpleasant. Yes, I remember that boy," confirmed the grandmother from the ground floor. Modest, so quiet. I felt very sorry for him. "Don't leave him alone. Help him. I'll come to the trial and tell it like it is." "Morris, I know this family," said the full-figured female janitor who had hitherto taken a cup in her office, indignantly, and at once changed to an indignant whisper. "How they bore me. You would know. One's a bully, the other drags men round at night. And Michael, poor, no wonder he ran away from them. The cattle were always bullying him. How the 5-year-old ended up in the woods outside of town remained a mystery. But for now, it came down to one thought. He'd escaped as best he could, and he'd been lucky enough to meet Alex. Bringing him back would be a huge mistake, and Helen was determined to do her best not to let that happen. The baby had stayed at the orphanage all this time. If the court decided to deprive his only guardian of parental rights, the boy would go to an orphanage. Alex also participated in the preparation for the meeting, was ready to speak at the trial. He was also allowed to see Michael together with Helen. They often came to the visiting room, brought toys and sweets, tried to support and cheer up the sad little man, who had a lot of problems. He was still silent, but smiled when they met, brought pictures and gave them little paper presents. Even though he didn't speak a word, Helen quickly learned to understand him. What really made it hard to communicate with was Travis. When he found out about what his wife was doing, he got angry, scandalized again. But Helen couldn't back down, which she tried to explain to him. At every conversation on the subject, he became distant, spent more and more time at work, became irritable, often threw in the direction of his wife's unhappy looks. Angry jokes, remarks, it was depressing. But there was no energy to solve another problem. Helen decided she would deal with it later. On the day of the trial, she was so happy that when she left the building, she couldn't stop thanking the people who had come to the meeting, shaking hands and saying goodbye warmly. Helen didn't notice the angry, hateful look that the red-haired woman who passed by gave her. If she had glanced at the car park for a moment, instead of telling Alex how worried she was, she would have seen an unpleasant picture. With quick steps on the heels of her shiny boots, Gwen reached the cars parked on the forecourt and stopped beside a black Audi in which a businessman in a suit was waiting for her. "This is it. I'm ready to cry," she said, and kicked the wheel with her foot. The man gestured for her to sit down and opened the passenger side door. "So what do we do now?" "Calm down," he replied, watching the 2 happy people 100 meters away. In their last conversation, Helen had told Alex that she had started putting together a packet of paperwork for the guardianship proceedings. If everything worked out, which she had no doubt it would, Michael would soon be home. And their home coziness, quiet environment, lessons with a child psychologist, and perhaps the boy will speak and successfully prepare for school. After all, he was not mute from birth. All these are the consequences of the stress. A week passed. Helen never rang or wrote again. Alex figured she had a lot on her plate. Why on earth would she let him know what she was going to do? But one brief item on the local news made him jump up from his seat with excitement. It happened on a normal workday, as he ate lunch in his coal-smelling stoker's room. A small television was running in the background on the table. Hearing Helen's name, Alex put the food away and turned up the volume. She'd disappeared without a trace 3 days ago, lost at work, and having not been reached all day, worried. Travis's phone had been ringing off the hook, but he'd been away on another business trip and had told everyone he didn't know anything, just like everyone else. The police thought about a possible robbery or kidnapping for ransom, but there was no confirmation of that yet. No one had phoned any relatives and Helen's own phone had been switched off. Alex scrambled to get going. He was sure that her husband was somehow involved in the case. Apparently, it was time to tell about what he had seen at the cottage. Keeping quiet about it now was not only pointless, but possibly dangerous. "And who are you to her?" a large bald man in a uniform asked unceremoniously. "Just an acquaintance," Alex replied calmly. "Listen. Acquaintance, didn't you hide her somewhere in the woods? And now you're trying to blame everything on others." The fat man leaned on the table and leaned right over him, which surprised Alex. "What have you heard about her husband? He's a man of influence, and it's kind of out of character to accuse him. You're the first suspect. No money, no place to live, so you took someone else's. The woman is well-to-do." Before Alex knew it, he was behind bars for the first time in his life. Having helped so much, he became a suspect himself. No word on Helen, and Michael sits alone and waits for someone to come to him, probably thinking that he has been forgotten. It's hard all on its own, and then there are the cellmates you can't find worse. 2 of the 3 men, though they didn't beat him, were constantly bullying his new neighbor, not letting him eat, taking his modest lunch. Alex didn't give in, which annoyed them even more. And one day they threw him off the bed and laid him face down on the dirty floor. "We'll confess," a husky voice hissed from above. "We'll keep quiet till morning, cause you look fragile. You'll see if your heart stops by accident." The next day the man lay motionless, staring at the wall. "New boy, got a smoke?" asked a skinny guy in a drab jumper from downstairs. "No, I don't smoke," Alex replied. "Well, you should," he replied cheerfully and pulled out a black and white photo from under his neighbor's pillow. "Who do you have that of?" the guy asked in a nasty voice, and started looking at the photo of a beautiful woman in a dress sitting on a bench under a flowering southern tree. "Give it back," Alex shouted and jumped off the bed. "And you ask for a better one." That photo was the only thing Alex had left of his mother. He didn't remember her, but as a child he often imagined her voice, her smile, and the way she sang lullabies to him. Alex also knew that he had a brother that he had never been able to find. Of course, now in his almost 35, he didn't indulge in big dreams of a family, but he always carried that picture with him. Even when he was cheated out of the flat he was entitled to as an orphan, he did not forget to take the photo with him. Because of it, there was a scuffle in the cell. Metal pots flew from the table, fists were used. The thin man rubbed his bruised cheek and wanted to hit back. But then a large man of about 50 years old, who had been lying silently most of the time reading some old book with pages yellowed by time, got up from the bottom bunk. He grabbed the thin man by the arm and sat him down on the bunk. The other stepped back himself and jumped up. "Now leave him alone," he said gravely, picking up a photograph torn down the middle from the floor and holding it out to Alex. "Take it." With that he returned to his seat, lay down, turned his back to the wall, and soon fell asleep. The other 2 fell silent, which Alex was glad of, because without them it was heavy with pain and fear. Meanwhile, Michael looked out the windows every day, waiting for Helen and Alex. All his presents had been given away to the other children. All that was left was a book and a bunny and a carrot. "They're not coming," his teacher told him as she saw someone standing in the corridor near the window again. "Your aunt is missing and your uncle is in jail for stealing from her, isn't he?" "No," Michael shouted after her, so that the woman opened her eyes wide in surprise and dropped the paper she was carrying into the office. "Is he talking?" It's not him," the boy rambled. "She killed Papa." The nanny, not understanding what was happening to him, took him to the ground floor of the orphanage to the psychologist's office. A girl with a pleasant voice and a kind smile sat Michael in a chair next to her desk. "Michael, I want to help you." "Tell me why you're crying," she asked caringly. "I heard everything. It's her. Aunt Helen's missing. Uncle Alex. Uncle Alex, it's not his fault." It took a moment to work out what he wanted to say. The girl listened to him patiently, asked a lot of clarifying questions, tried to distract him, and then took him back to the other children, and going out to the tutor in the corridor, said, "We must be sure to report this to the police." Of course, few people would believe the words of a 5-year-old boy who has gone through such stress over the past year. But still, if his words are to be believed, his stepmother had discussed his father's death with someone before the accident. In the process of finding out, Alex and Michael's stepmother were brought in for questioning. The man stared into her face, trying to remember where he might have seen this red-haired lady before, capriciously talking about how she didn't have time to go to the police station on every occasion, especially since she had already been stripped of her stepson's parental rights. "Are you Gwen?" he exclaimed, and was immediately shouted down by the investigator, asking him not to be distracted. "You're Helen's husband's mistress." The girl fell silent, startled. "And how do you know that?" the investigator asked sternly. "Look in my statement that I gave when I saw the story about Helen on the news. I told you there that I saw her husband and his mistress in her house, but I kept quiet about it." "So that's her," Alex explained, pointing to Gwen. This unexpected chain, suddenly born in his head, overlapped with what Michael had said. Travis was finally called in for questioning. Seeing Gwen, he suddenly thought that because of her he could be under suspicion, and began to deny any connection with her. Alas, he made it worse for himself, because his entire office was aware of their relationship, and it wasn't hard to find out. Back in the cell, Alex was surprised to see that the two men who were testing his strength every day had disappeared, and the silent man continued to lie in the same position he was in when he was taken away for interrogation. "Well, will it be long, or is there a chance?" he asked, without turning round. "Sort of turned up now," Alex replied. "Going to make some tea." "Yeah, I've got some dried goods." "Where have those two gone?" "Who knows them? What's that picture under your pillow?" he asked, pulling out a bag of small rusks from somewhere. "Mother's. Or maybe just the carers cut it out of some magazine to make me feel better. I don't know." "So you're from an orphanage?" "I'd rather be from an orphanage, too, than with a mum like mine." The man who had previously seemed withdrawn and stern became talkative, though he had lost hope. He was released every 3 or 4 years and then returned. "It's my fate, I guess," he explained to Alex. The simple human conversation made him feel much better. All the more so now that something was slowly unraveling behind the closed door. Maybe soon that door would open and he would be released. Freedom had never been so welcome as it was now. Helen was found in an abandoned house far outside the city. She had been locked in a windowless room and had eaten nothing for 2 days. Even the bread and water she had been fed had run out, and she had no hope of getting out. When Helen heard voices, she screamed and banged on the walls as hard as she could. A few minutes later, she was being led outside and helped into an ambulance. The day she disappeared, her husband suggested that they meet, go to a hotel in the middle of the woods to rest, and at the same time to discuss adoption, because he supposedly rethought everything and is ready to participate in the fate of the boy. Of course, she trusted, not expecting a catch. As soon as the busy motorway was behind them, Travis stopped the car, his face twisted with anger. He told her how long he'd been waiting for this moment when he could stop pretending. Helen couldn't remember anything further. Apparently, he had hit her so hard that she had lost consciousness. Even knowing what had happened and how it had happened, she couldn't believe in the reality of what was happening. The same obsessive thought kept going round and round in her head endlessly. Is it really possible to live with such a stranger for so many years without noticing anything? How did he manage to play this role? How he never once suspected that he was not going on a business trip, but to his mistress. There were and could be no answers. She trusted him too much. It was disgusting to realize that so many people around her knew about everything, but no one had told her about it. Though would she have believed it? Travis and his red-headed accomplice were apprehended. They began a long investigation into the circumstances of Michael's father's death, Helen's illegal retention, the theft of money from the construction company's coffers, the attempt to abscond with them, and much more. It had only been a month, and it seemed like a whole year. Helen and Alex were walking from the car park towards the shelter, talking animatedly. It was a momentous and much anticipated day, which made everyone in high spirits. "Do you think he'll be happy if we go straight to a cafe with a good children's menu and a playroom? Or is it better to go home first, and then have some fun in the evening?" worried the new mom. "I think we should ask him," Alex replied cheerfully. "Oh right, really," Helen said with a sigh. Helen stood in front of the gate, shuffling from foot to foot as if she were taking an exam. Michael, on the other hand, ran down the corridor, meeting them as they made their way up to the first floor of the building. He didn't yet know that he would be leaving with them this time. So out of habit, he led them into the playroom. Helen sat down beside him, took the boy's small hands in hers and said, "Michael, we have a surprise for you. You're going home." Tears welled up in her eyes. Michael looked at her, then at Alex, as if he didn't know what they meant, and nodded timidly in agreement. "Come on then, let's go and say goodbye to everyone." As they went out, a few dozen little faces saw them off in the windows, until the kindergarten teacher sent them off to lunch. Helen couldn't stay in the flat she had lived in with Travis, so she sold it almost as soon as she got back. Instead, she bought a new one, closer to work, bigger and brighter, with a beautiful view of the park. There was a huge nursery waiting for Michael, with a car-shaped bed, a balloon pool, and a big tent of toys, in which he immediately placed his battered bunny. "Why don't you stay?" Helen asked when, after a fun day out with the three of them, Alex got ready to leave. A year later, they couldn't say that anymore. Had that phrase started their relationship, or had it happened much earlier? Alex had since recovered, changed his clothes, and got a job in his profession as an engineer. He refused to work in his wife's company, saying that everyone should have their own sphere for realization. She agreed, still holding the past difficult experience in her memory. Another discovery awaited them ahead. One summer afternoon, Michael, riding his bicycle, over-accelerated and fell to the pavement at speed, injuring his leg. A minor operation was needed, and just in case, blood tests were taken from his foster parents so that they could act as donors. What was the surprise when it turned out that Alex and Michael are relatives not only on paper? Everything fell into place. A strange external resemblance. They both had a mop of blonde curls, blue eyes, a common habit of sleeping with their hands behind their heads, and one leg over the other, and a lot of other everyday details that Helen was always amazed by. Alex thought with sadness about how close he was to his brother, but never had time to get to know him. Perhaps he remembered more about his parents and could tell them what happened and why they ended up in the orphanage. And on the other hand, he miraculously managed to save his nephew, who began to call him Daddy more and more often. That family could not be returned, but he created a new one, the one he had dreamed of all his life. Strong, friendly, loving. With bedtime stories, weekend camping trips, and fun holidays. Yes, Helen and Michael are his family, which he will always cherish and love. A father sets up a camera to save his fading daughter, and after barely a glance at the tape, Jane decided at an early age that girls were either beautiful or smart. The girl knew full well she could choose, and she chose to be smart. In front of her eyes was the example of her older sister Ellen. Everyone around admired her beauty. I mean, come on, light blonde hair, silky green, mermaid eyes. A figure they call such a model. Helen, from an early age, was focused only on her appearance. She read a lot, but it was fashion magazines with advice on makeup, diets, and so on. And Kate's girlfriends were exactly the same. Jane thought they were pretty, frivolous fools. A mother raising two daughters alone had high hopes for her eldest. "When you marry well, Ellen, we'll have a good life," she used to say. Jane was still a very young girl, studying in the 4th or 5th grade. The girl was frankly perplexed. How could one put the responsibility for her happiness and well-being on some other person? Did her mother, who had been burned herself, not draw the right conclusions? Once Jane asked her mother directly, "You married your father for his money too, and he left us, went to a younger and prettier, and left nothing for you or the children, because she had a good appetite. And now you're telling Ellen to do the same thing, so she'll do the same. Blaspheme on your tongue." Mum shook her hands. "Helen is different. Firstly, she's young, and secondly, she's much prettier than me. And anyway, she has me. I'm the one who had to figure it out. And I'll help her, and I'll teach her everything. You'll be fine, and so will you, if you listen to me." Jane just sighed heavily. Her mother was beautiful and kind, but she was too easygoing. Both her mother and Ellen lived with rose-colored glasses on their eyes, Everyone dreamed of a beautiful life, believed that looks were the determining factor in a woman's success. But it wasn't so for everyone. Jane differed from her peers' warehouse of character, has always been pragmatic, responsible, far-sighted. And she clearly understood that, in order to achieve something in this life, you need to work hard. And the options that have in mind mother and older sister, rich men, benefactors, it's all unreliable, fragile, illusory. Helen jokingly called her little sister a bore. Her mother was always trying to remake Jane, to impose her point of view on her daughter. The most interesting thing is that the parent sincerely believed that she wished her child well. She said, "I'm worried about your future. How can you not understand? You are a beauty. We got such a one. You got the best from me and your father. When you finish school, we'll find you a wealthy fiancé. Don't be such a bore. Men like cheerful, smiling women." "No, thank you," Jane replied. "After school, I'm going to study economics." "But do you know what the competition is?" Helen would always argue at this point. "You either have to be 7 inches in the head, or you have to have a good deal of goodwill." "Yes," Mum sighed. "We can't afford commercial education. And you can't get in for free." But Jane, trying not to listen to the arguments of her sister and mother, strived for her goal. Day and night she sat over textbooks, looked for additional courses on the internet, mostly free, because her mother, who worked as a cashier in the local supermarket, had no money for her daughter's education, and her father almost did not participate in the children's lives. He had a new family. No, he still transferred some pennies of alimony, but everything was limited to that. No communication, no support or help in difficult situations. Jane knew from childhood that she could not count on him. The girl in her heart wanted at least once to meet and talk to her second parent. It seemed to her that, perhaps, the character she went just in it, because the mother in Helen Jane did not resemble at all. But he did not seek to meet his daughters. And Jane didn't want to impose. And it was scary to face indifference, or even worse, dislike of a native man. Dad was a businessman, owned a chain of shops, so sort of made good money. But all his property was prudently written down on the new wife, so that the ex-wife and children did not claim anything. It looked ugly, petty, even mean. In theory, Jane should have been as resentful of her father as her mother was, as Helen was. But Jane had a dream to study to be an economist, to start her own business, and one day to meet her father on some business, a joint project, a profitable contract, something like that. Let him see what his daughter had achieved on her own, without his help. And then maybe they could talk as equals. And Jane achieved her goal. She got into the budget, to the same economics faculty, where she was so eager to go. How happy she was when she saw herself on the list of enrolled. She was screaming right in front of the computer monitor, jumping from happiness to the ceiling. "You're crazy," Helen said as she looked into the room with little Andrew in her arms. She had recently become a mother and had a son with a rich man. He paid child support, but he was reluctant to communicate with his mother and Andrew himself. Needless to say, these alimony were pennies, a standard scheme, gray earnings, most of the income is hidden. Helen still repeated the fate of her mother, even in an even worse version. But she was not going to give up and continued to dream of a prince, who will definitely sooner or later solve all her financial problems. Her mother supported her eldest daughter in everything, adored her grandson. It was not surprising. Jane was also happy to take care of the baby when she had time. But the girl did not understand how it was possible not to draw conclusions from what had happened. Was it not clear? The plan is not very good and often fails. It was time to choose another option. But no, Helen was still looking for rich men on dating sites. I got in. Jane explained her strange behavior to her sister. "Wow. Cool. So what, you're leaving us for the big city now? You're going to go to school?" Jane and her family actually lived in a city too, but a very small one, far from the regional center. So gray 3-story houses, whole streets of old wooden barracks, a huge private sector. Not a village by documents, of course, but in fact it is a village. That's why Orchardville, the regional capital, where Jane's university was located, was called just town. Her mother, too, was happy to hear of her youngest daughter's admission. She had never hoped for such a thing. As it turned out, she thought. Let her dream, show off, and when she realizes that nothing has worked out, She will follow in her mother's footsteps to the supermarket for the cash register. But also will think, finally, over the words of more experienced relatives realize, it is necessary to look for a rich and reliable man. And here's how it all turned out. Jane got in. Well done, the daughter hugged the younger mother. I'll help you in any way I can. I'm sorry, I won't be able to send much money, but at least a little for housing and living expenses. Again, you need to dress nicely. There's a better chance of meeting a decent man in a big city. Mum, there you go again, Jane smiled. She was touched by the fact that her mother supported and understood her, and even offered to help her. Jane knew it wasn't easy for her mother to get the money, but she was willing to help her daughter while she was a student. And that's priceless. Jane had a new life. She was given a room in the student dormitory, though not a separate one. The room had to be shared with 2 girls. But the roommates turned out to be very pleasant. Both studied at the Pedagogical Institute. Both, just like Jane herself, were focused on study and work. In general, the girls had a lot in common. With one of these neighbors, Kate, Jane even became friends. They stayed in touch even after they finished their studies and moved out to rented flats. Jane liked her studies. She was convinced in her first year that she had chosen the right direction. She found economics easy, lectures seemed interesting, and term papers and tests were incredibly easy. Jane even began to earn money. It turned out that people were willing to pay a lot of money by her standards, of course, for essays and projects. The girl had to work part-time and study a lot. She had no time at all for student parties, going to clubs and similar entertainments. And sometimes, of course, Jane wanted to go for a walk, to unwind. But she realized that every minute counted. Her time was too precious. Besides, there was no money. Her mother tried to top up her daughter's card with a small amount every month. Jane knew that it was a significant part of her mother's salary, and she was very grateful to her. It was not enough, very little. Still, it was the help from her mum that kept Jane afloat. Especially after the 3rd year, when suddenly something in the university clinic changed, and students were obliged to pay for the dormitory. And before it was possible to live in it for free. Jane saved money on literally everything. But she couldn't keep up. She knew that she was going to her goal, which means that sooner or later everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Everything will be as she dreamed. But on New Year's Eve, an event happened that made Jane reconsider her plans and turned her whole life upside down. It happened at that hectic time when, before the New Year, students try to pass all credits in time to start the winter session after the holiday without debts. Jane was just getting ready for a credit in economic history when she received a phone call from her sister. Helen's picture popped up on the screen. On it, the girl was smiling broadly and looked like a star. Jane knew at once that something was wrong. Helen would not call her at the 3rd hour of the night. It was Jane who was awake, preparing for exams. And her sister herself at that time should be having her 7th dream. Mum's in trouble. Helen's voice rang through the receiver. It seemed she was close to hysterics. Come over. What's wrong? Jane felt her limbs grow cold and her stomach felt empty for some reason. Anxiety gripped her heart with an icy hand. Was she alive? But it was impossible to get a coherent answer from Helen. She was already sobbing and sobbing into the receiver, dropping only a few insignificant phrases. Mostly they were wails about how she was afraid and badly off, as if the trouble had happened in the evening, but Helen was informed only now, just a couple of minutes ago, and she immediately dialed her sister. Of course, at that moment there was no question of any credits and exams. Jane took the first flight home in the morning. She was almost the only passenger at the bus station at such an early hour. Jane found her sister in a terrible state, her hair disheveled, her face swollen with tears. In her arms she held her youngest daughter, Lillian, a baby girl. Helen was already a mother of many children. Her eldest son, Andrew, then 2 girls, yearlings, Chris and Lillian. None of the fathers were involved in the upbringing of the children. The princes, sons of wealthy parents, refused to raise offspring and basked in money. With Helen, they were just having fun, with nothing serious in mind. And she kept stepping on the same rake, getting pregnant on purpose in the hope of finding a happy, strong family. If something happens to me, how will I cope with them alone? Helen looked at Jane with confused eyes, as if expecting her to offer a way out. But Jane was ready to hit her sister at that moment. She didn't know what was wrong with her mother, and she was only thinking about herself. How did it happen? She asked. They had a corporate party, Ellen said, rocking her daughter. They must have been drinking. They told me Mum was crossing the road in the wrong place. Jumped out in front of that bus. The driver couldn't do anything. He's in shock himself. He's kind of in hospital now, too. He had a heart attack right there on the spot while it was being sorted out. While they were sorting it out. I got a call late last night, and I called you straight away. So Mum's alive? Jane clarified. That was the most important thing to her. What hospital is she in? A hospital not far away. Jane jumped out of the house, hailed a taxi. She had to get there as soon as possible. She had to find out what was wrong with her loved one. At the hospital, Jane got the terrible news. Mum's gone. She'd only recently passed away. As Jane rushed to the clinic, it all happened in the ICU. The doctor then said that there was no chance of a good outcome. The injuries were too serious. And Jane would not have been able to say goodbye to her mother anyway. She was in a coma. And still the girl blamed herself for her carelessness, for not supporting her mother by the hand while she was still alive. Jane was signing some papers when she received a phone call from a sobbing Ellen. She had been informed by someone on the nursing staff, and now the older sister was in a state of near panic. It had been a difficult time. Arranging the funeral, trying to bring the sister who had to look after her babies no matter what, and the gradual realization of the terrible fact that the nearest and dearest person in the world was now gone. Just no, that's all. The father did not turn up at the funeral, although he could not have been unaware of what had happened. This man did not even call his daughters, did not try to understand whether they need his help. Probably thought they were adults. They were both over 18. So legally, the father was no longer their debtor. He paid child support until his daughters came of age, and there was nothing more to expect. It was then that Jane realized that she would not meet or communicate with this man, even when she reached the top of her career. He didn't need her and Ellen and Mum. Neither did they need him. There was no resentment. No, it's just that Jane suddenly realized her father was a complete stranger to her. They may look alike in some ways, but Dad is a stranger. He's just a stranger, and that says it all. Ellen, on the other hand, is her own person. She needs support. Ellen sobbed nonstop for days. Jane didn't stop her. Let her cry it out. It would make her feel better. While her sister dealt with her grief, Jane helped her with her nieces. The little ones made her smile even in such a dreadful situation. It was impossible to look indifferently at their funny games, to listen to their cute babbling. The nieces, like nothing else, showed Jane that life goes on. Jane could not stay with her sister for long. The winter session. Ellen had already recovered a little and even started monitoring dating sites again. Now she wanted a supportive adult around her even more. Her mum was gone. Jane's session, in spite of everything, passed with honors. That meant an increased scholarship, but the money wouldn't even be enough to rent a room for a month. The dormitory became paid because you still had to eat, dress, pay for travel. Jane tried to combine her studies and work in the cafeteria. It turned out to be impossible immediately. A lot of passes and debts were accumulated. As a result, the girl did not even get admission to the next session. Expulsion loomed ahead. Teachers took into account the previous merits of the girl and went to her satisfaction. But she still failed. The only way out was to transfer to the correspondence department. Only here's the catch: the budget places were all taken. The commercial option cost a fabulous amount of money for Jane. The rector suggested a way out. One day he called Jane to his office and offered her the only, in his opinion, suitable option. I know your situation. You wouldn't wish it on your enemy, began the conversation with a man who always reminded Jane of Carlson as good-natured, full, and short. Student, you are diligent and promising. I want to help such a person. That's why I'll close the session for you. No matter what. Let us draw red lines. And you take a year's leave of absence. I'll help you get a job for family reasons. Get the money for your studies. You can do it. You're a man of determination. And when you come back, I'll help you with all the details. How's that? Jane thought about it. She didn't want to interrupt her studies. On the other hand, what other options did she have? The session is not passed, that's for sure. So she'd have to drop out. And where to go? Go home to her parents' flat? Her mother's new boyfriend is already living there. A young and kind of nice guy named George. Unlike the previous aluminum suitors, He's not a rich major. The guy works on a construction site, working from dawn to dusk, earning money. Seems to like Helen a lot, and he's taken in her kids. Maybe they'll actually make a family. Jane's not really needed there right now. And she doesn't want to live with her sister. No, Jane loves her very much. She's the only person in the whole world who's family. But still, Jane's used to peace, solitude, freedom. And there's a family of many children. You can't do that there. And after all, I don't want to leave Chicago. It's a big city. It's beautiful, spacious, interesting. There are more prospects for work and study here. The urban settlement, where Jane's childhood was spent, was associated with rage and hopeless longing. No, she didn't want to go back there at all. You know, I think I'll take you up on your offer. Jane smiled at the rector. What a clever girl, asked the man. You're good. Everything will work out for you. Just don't forget to save for your studies. Be sure to come back to the university in a year. We'll be waiting for you. Deal? It's a deal. Thank you so much for the offer. That same night, Jane started looking for a job. She urgently needed money just to survive, to buy food, to pay for a roof over her head, the most effective motivation. It turned out that it was simply unrealistic for a girl with an incomplete university degree to find anything close to the desired profession. Jane was rejected everywhere. Employers did not even consider candidates without a diploma. The girl realized that she could show herself at the interview, but it did not even come to that. After a couple of days of fruitless searches, Jane realized that it was time to give up her dream of working as an economist, or rather to postpone it until better times. In the meantime, she had to find something. When the bar was lowered a bit, things got better. There were plenty of jobs for Jane: waitress, cleaner, saleswoman, but the wages were meager. No, it was enough to live on, especially if you saved money. But Jane had to save up for a year's study. With those salaries, it was impossible. Still, Jane needed a job badly. Immediately, she chose the path of a waitress in a bar in the city center. There were plenty of reasons for the job. Firstly, there was extra pay for night shifts. Secondly, tips were very helpful, sometimes even very generous. And thirdly, the last job gave Jane the opportunity to write term papers and tests to order. And an extra penny in the piggy bank, and brains are not idle. That's the upside. Jane even liked working in the bar. The team is friendly, the bosses are loyal. The crowd was decent. It was a rock bar whose owners cared about their reputation. The atmosphere was monitored. Undesirable elements were expelled with guards and not allowed back in. And another. Local band musicians, performers, and visiting guests gathered here every night. In short, live music, and it was beautiful. Jane enjoyed listening to the musicians perform, singing along, dancing. This was welcome in the bar. To work as on holiday. In the bar, Jane finally understood the meaning of this common phrase. Of course, with a waitress's salary, there was not much money. Jane was looking for another job in parallel, a higher paying one. But the girl knew, even when she had to quit, she would come here to visit, just to be in this amazingly warm atmosphere. A rock bar and new friends helped Jane through her grief. Of course, the longing for her mother did not go anywhere, but the girl was finally able to return to life and believe that there are still a lot of good things ahead. It was in the rock bar that Jane met Jasper. One day, the host introduced the guests to a new rock band which appeared just a couple of months ago. Jasper was the bass player. But not only that, it was he who owned the idea to create this band. He was the one who wrote the songs and the music. Modest, always kept in the shadows, but constantly observing the behavior of the band members, the reaction of the audience. Jasper was the main man in the team. Although on stage most of the attention was drawn to the lead singer, it was felt. It was noticeable from the first glance. For some reason, Jane immediately singled him out and reached for him. She didn't recognize herself. Jane realized that she was not in a position to fall in love and have affairs. She was focused on her career, on her studies, on getting back on track at university. She couldn't be distracted by that. And yet, Jasper didn't flirt with the waitresses, didn't talk to anyone first. He was serious, focused on his work. Maybe that's what attracted the girl. Jasper was a lot like herself. Jasper began to appear in the bar often, sometimes with a group to work with, sometimes just in the company of mates to relax. Of course, they soon got to know each other, but he still acted aloof, not overtly sympathetic. Sometimes, though, Jane caught his eye. But Jasper turned away immediately, talking to someone else. And Jane wanted him to pay attention to her, to compliment her, to show her signs of attention, as visitors often did. And then Jane would let him know that she was interested in him. Once there was a girl in Jasper's company. Representatives of the fair half of humanity had come with him before, but they were just friends, girlfriends of other members of the group. And this one was clearly something between them. They didn't kiss or hug, nothing like that, but sometimes they exchanged tender glances and smiled very warmly at each other. Once she put her head right on his shoulder, and Jasper, usually cold and even stern, stroked her hair in a natural and very gentle gesture, as if she were a kitten. A very unpleasant feeling came into Jane's breast from behind the gate. She recognized it immediately, of course. It was jealousy. With surprising meticulousness, Jane began to pick out her rival's faults. Too thin, not even pretty. That nose, long, liquid hair. Anyway, how can this madam compare to her, Jane? For the first time in her life, Jane seemed to feel smug about her appearance. Nature had endowed her, like Helen, with beauty. Jane had heard many compliments from others about her figure. Tall, slender, long-legged. Her friends generally advised her to try her hand at modeling. Only this job was not to Jane's liking at all. Well, she did not know how to show herself, even considered it humiliating. And now, despite such impressive external data, the rival became such a gray mouse. In general, there was nothing outstanding in Jasper's companion, not even something to catch his eye. Nevertheless, he clearly had very tender feelings for her. The presence of this girl made him happy. Jane watched Jasper closely and could tell this for sure he loved his companion. It was painful. Thanks to the girl that Jasper was so attracted to, Jane had made up her mind, decided to do something she'd never considered unacceptable before. Her shift was coming to an end, but as usual she stayed late to help a waitress friend serve tables on a Saturday night. There were a lot of customers, and Jane waited for an opportune moment. She'd even had a few drinks beforehand for courage, to make her feel more confident and relaxed. Jasper stood up and headed for the exit. Someone had called him. The music was blaring in the bar. Impossible to talk on the phone in this environment. Everyone was either outside on the porch of the bar or in the smoking room. Jasper chose the street. Jane followed him like a shadow now or never. The obnoxious girl who had been sitting next to Jasper all evening remained at the table. She chatted cheerfully with his mates. It was obvious that they had all known each other for a long time. They must be in a long and serious relationship. Still, Jane would try, or she'd regret later that she'd never even tried. Jasper stepped out onto the porch. He paced the area in front of the bar, patiently explaining something to someone. Jane watched him through the large window. Jasper wasn't smiling, wasn't joking. Apparently the conversation was serious or unpleasant. It didn't matter. Jane would still approach him as soon as. Jasper pressed the reset button and was about to go back to the bar, but at that moment Jane came out to meet him. Luckily, they were alone on the porch at that moment. "Hi," Jane smiled at him. Jane smiled at him. Jasper looked at her with interest. "We said hello," Jane nodded. "I need to talk to you." Jasper immediately tuned into the conversation. He showed that he was ready to listen. He could have dismissed her, or shown irritation or displeasure. But Jasper looked at her with his dark, intelligent eyes and waited. "I like you, and I've liked you for a long time," Jane decided to cut to the chase. "I'm magnetically attracted to you. It's never happened to me before. I don't know what to do about it." Jane lowered her eyes. There, she'd said it. What's next? Jasper was probably looking for words to reject her as politely as possible. He probably was. Jane suddenly felt unbearably ashamed of what she'd done. Why had she gone to him? How could she look him in the eye after all this? Jasper often came to the bar. And then Jane felt his hands on her shoulders. A gentle touch, as if she were some incredibly fragile vessel. Jane, her name came out of Jasper's lips and sounded like beautiful music to the girl. Jane, I couldn't even imagine such a thing. Jasper looked at her and smiled. He so rarely smiled after all. His eyes, the girl could see it clearly, shone with happiness. Sincere, real happiness. What's going on? Was he happy to hear her confession? Instead of words, Jasper kissed Jane. It made the girl dizzy. He had his arms around her. He held her, or rather even held her, because her legs were literally shaking from the kiss. Then he stroked her back and head and held her gently against him. I've been watching you for a long time, too, and I'm drawn to you in the same way. Then why? Jane didn't understand. I didn't even notice it once. I thought you didn't care. I didn't mean to embarrass you, Jasper said. You shouldn't. Anyway, I'm older. Older for you. I thought you were attracted to other guys, brutal, successful. With your looks, anything's possible. You're beautiful. You're unreal. You even inspired my song. Didn't realize I'm an Olympic princess? Is that about me? Jane asked. No, she admitted. It's a very beautiful song. I love it. I didn't realize it came from you. Oh yeah, it's just... What about that girl who came with you? Are you two together? Together, Jasper grinned. Ever since my parents brought me a pink bow tied to a box from the maternity ward and told me Lassie was my sister. So she's your sister? Jane laughed. I thought she was. That's why I decided to have this conversation today. Sister and Sister, Jasper said, pulling Jane tighter against him and breathing in the scent of her hair. Passing through town. She's been married a long time, lives with her husband. Far away. She missed her wayward brother. Jane and Jasper started seeing each other. Turns out he'd been hitting on the pretty waitress all this time. Why didn't he make any moves on her? I was going to. But later, when he's a little more cash flush. He had a clear message: a girl shouldn't be a loser. So far, there was too much to do with the band, organizing gigs and so on. But the guys were already starting to earn money from their songs. The prospects were looking good. And strange as it may seem for a rock musician, Jasper was shy with girls. No, he had a lot of friends with whom he could chat and laugh together. But Jane evoked a very special feeling in him. And that made Jasper, who was used to performing in front of hundreds of people, timid. But Jane made the first step, shattering all of Jasper's doubts. And now they were together. Jasper suggested they move in together. They decided on Jane's flat. Convenient location, reasonable price, cozy room. So it was Jasper who moved in with her. But he immediately took upon himself to pay the rent and minor repairs, which every dwelling needs from time to time. And it also turned out that Jasper is an excellent cook. Jane's culinary talents paled in comparison to his skills. Jasper, as befits a creative man, created real masterpieces, whether in the recording studio or in the kitchen. He was gentle, sensitive, and attentive, fully immersed in his work, but not forgetting about his beloved. They talked a lot, often went for walks. Sometimes together they discussed the next song, spinning in Jasper's head and ready to be born. Sometimes Jane would suggest to her lover the right phrase or words. He happily grasped the idea, and then the girl felt proud of herself. How about it? She took part in the creation of a hit. Jane completely dissolved in her feelings and new sensations. Before meeting Jasper, she didn't know what it was love for a man. She hadn't had time for that before. First studying hard, then trying to survive. It turned out to be so pleasant to be near a man who embraces you, interested in your mood and well-being, looking at you with admiring eyes, as at some princess, and to melt from the touch of his warm, strong hands. Knowing that he, this tall man with black eyes, would do anything for you. Helen didn't approve of her sister's choice. As always, you have your own measure of everything. He's poor, he doesn't even have his own flat. Again, no steady job, no business. He's a musician, he's got his own rock band. So what? Who needs them anyway? There's a lot of these one-day bands, you never know if they're going to be successful. I think you got the wrong guy. With your looks. You shouldn't say that. I have 3 children. Who needs me? So I'm content with what fate gives me, I don't complain. But you. Jane didn't expect her sister to understand, though. They were always too different. But Jane didn't need understanding. She was happy, she was loved. She had someone close and dear to her. Yes, he was going through a difficult time. But Jasper tried, went to his goal, worked hard, looked for the right contacts, planned something. Jane supported him in all his endeavors, and he appreciated her devotion. Many times he said that he was grateful to fate for such a gift for her. One day Jasper made a rather risky venture, invited a famous rock band to Chicago. It was planned that his band would perform as a warm-up act for the famous musicians. This event was to increase the popularity of Jasper's band. Well, and in general, the organization of such concerts is a way to make good money. But something went wrong. Not as many people came to the concert as planned. There was a big rock festival in a neighboring state. Jasper didn't take that into account. Or rather, he found out about the festival too late, when everything was already in full swing. In general, Jasper went into a big disadvantage: payment of musicians' fees, hall rent and equipment, tickets for the rock band, promotional activities. All this was paid off only half of the money from ticket sales. The concert itself went great, but Jasper had huge debts that needed to be closed as soon as possible. But with what? It was hard for Jane to look at her lover. During this period, he looked confused, anxious. I wanted to help him in some way. How? Where did Jane get the money? Jasper took out a loan, but it was a drop in the ocean. His friends helped him, the situation improved, but the debt was still quite substantial. And then Jane offered to help. She had savings, money she'd put aside for her studies. Not much, of course, but still. In addition, the girl did what she was against for a long time, took out a consumer loan. These funds were quite enough to cover the debt. From where? Jasper was surprised when Jane handed him several wads of brand new, crisp notes. I just got paid back out of the blue, plus the insurance. Finally paid off my mobile phone bill, she lied. She knew if she told Jasper the truth, he'd never take the money from her. As it was, it wasn't like it was the last, randomly coming in. Thank you, Jasper hugged Jane tightly. I'll pay you back. You'll see, we'll be famous soon, and I'll pay it all back. Jasper paid the debt and continued to develop the group. Jane slowly paid off the loan. It was no longer possible to save for her studies, and her salary had suddenly become much smaller. The bar had fallen on hard times. It was good that Jasper bought groceries and paid the rent of the flat. That is, he took the main part of the expenses on himself. Jasper's income came from a few corporate gigs and the occasional part-time job. Unsteady income, but still the stream never dried up. Jane didn't worry about the financial side of their relationship. She enjoyed Jasper's attention, bathed in his love and care, and generously gave him tenderness, love and support. Jane tried not to think about the future. But if she did not recover at the university this year, she would do it next year. It would be all right. She still had time. The main thing is that he, Jasper, is there for her. Jane hadn't realized she was capable of such feelings before. And then Jasper disappeared. No, he hadn't run away from Jane. Nothing terrible had happened to him. It started out as a business trip. Can you imagine? Jasper grabbed Jane's shoulder and even shook her a little. His eyes burned like two bright spotlights. I was invited to New York to write music for a band. They found me on the internet, they liked me, and now they're inviting me. Jane couldn't believe her ears. She knew the band Jasper was talking about. They were very popular musicians, touring all over the world, and they had noticed Jasper. They're offering him a collaboration. Unbelievable. I'm going to have to go away for a while, Jasper continued. Do you realize what that means? Jane nodded. She understood money, fame, dizzying opportunities for Jasper's growth and development as a musician, useful acquaintances and connections. Jasper would get things he'd never dreamed of. But it looks like they'll have to part ways indefinitely. After all, Jasper clearly said, I have to leave, not we. The packing began. Jasper had a lot of things to sort out. Firstly, he had to find a replacement. Someone had to play in his band for him temporarily while he was away. Secondly, Jasper had to organize his passport and visa. Thirdly, collecting the necessary things. In all the hustle and bustle, he seemed to have forgotten all about Jane. Jasper was too absorbed in the upcoming changes and prospects. The girl looked at him and realized that he would forget about her in another country, muffled by new impressions, excited by work and success. Perhaps Jasper would even find someone there. But Jasper had hugged her so tenderly in the evenings, so sincerely assured her that he would miss her. Time would fly by quickly. And then there's the video link. We'll be in touch with each other all the time. At least I'll finally earn a decent living, pay you back what I owe you. I know how much you need that money. Maybe we can even buy a flat. My band will get bigger. I'll gain invaluable experience. I'll know what to do and how to do it. It's going to be okay, Jasper said sincerely. Jane could see that he wasn't lying, wasn't deceiving. But something told her that everything would change as soon as her beloved was abroad. It was just that Jasper himself did not realize it yet. And that's how it turned out in the end. At first, Jasper called every day, as promised, and told her how he had settled down in his new place. Everything delighted him, and he was overwhelmed by the experience. And then he suddenly dropped off the radar. He just disappeared. He didn't call himself, and he didn't answer Jane's calls. The long ring-back tones ended steadily with the message that the caller was probably busy, so he couldn't answer. Jane was alarmed at first. She thought that something had happened to him, something terrible, irreparable. But soon she saw the band playing on the music channel. Jasper was with them. He looked different, older and more serious than usual. I mean, there was nothing wrong with him. It's just that he'd apparently decided to start a new life and cut all ties, including forgetting about her. And Jane? At first, the girl still hoped, waited for him to call, to explain everything. But Jasper was gone, completely out of her life. Jane made it a habit to watch the music channel every day. Every now and then she'd see Jasper. He was never the center of attention, but he was still caught in the camera lens sometimes. And quite often there was a girl next to him, the same one. Either a makeup artist or the band's costumer. Beautiful, colorful. Apparently there was something between her and Jasper, couldn't help but be. Jane was desperately jealous of Jasper, both of this girl and of the other potential women of her lover. She was hurt as she had ever been. And also hurt and scared. Scared of being alone again, without the support, the warmth of a loved one. An unpleasant mixture of feelings and emotions. And there were other problems more pressing. Money. Jane was barely making ends meet. After all, she had a tiny salary and a loan. Eventually, the bar went bankrupt. The new owners bought it and turned it into a hookah lounge. Jane had to quit like all the other employees. Another blow. Jane had special memories and feelings about this place. And now the bar was gone, a cozy bar where she could always enjoy live music, where there was a friendly, warm atmosphere. Jasper would understand, support her. Everything was easier and more pleasant with him in general. But he was hundreds of kilometers away from her and seemed to have forgotten all about her. Jasper had no idea how desperate she was. He never found out about the loan. He thought Jane had helped him out with the extra money she'd suddenly received. And of course he had no idea she'd been fired. And if he did, what would he care about her now? Jane had no time to go over her grievances and think about what it would be like if she was in desperate need of a job, and preferably a decent paying one. And that's why she was tirelessly perusing the adverts. She wanted to find something that would help her get out of the financial hole. Good, at least the owner of the flat agreed to wait with payment. But he's got a lot of patience too. Jane would be asked to leave in a heartbeat. The ad caught Jane's eye with the amount of money they were offering for her services. Not a bad figure. It could solve a lot of the girl's problems, but the job itself seemed too unfamiliar to her. A carer was needed for a little girl. It didn't seem to specify the diagnosis, but whoever had advertised it had made it clear that the child needed round-the-clock care and supervision, including taking medication by the hour, accompanying her to procedures, and so on. Jane reflected. She had experience in caring for babies. Thank you, Helen, to her mentor. The girl even enjoyed fiddling with her nephews. She knew how to get along with small children, knew how to feed them, change them, keep them occupied. But here we were talking about a sick child, apparently seriously ill. Could she do it? At least it was worth a try. Jane called the number given, and a pleasant male voice answered. The man asked her a few questions: age, occupation, education, experience with small children. And she was invited for an interview. Jane was nervous the day before. She wanted the job. Jane needed it like air. It was a chance to get out of a financial hole, to stay afloat. Where else would you find a salary like that? That's why Jane was worried, anxious. What if she didn't get the job? What then to look for a place as a waitress again? To work for a pittance? The taxi brought Jane to a country cottage village, an elite neighborhood, tall, beautiful houses surrounded by fences. At the gate, the girl was met by a woman, an au pair. As Jane found out later, in fact, the person who did everything: cleaning, cooking, laundry. Because her employer, Kevin, was always too busy. Businessmen in general have very little free time. Kevin met the job applicants in the living room. He was a man in his 40s with intelligent, piercing blue eyes, perfectly styled hair with light gray. An athletic figure. Yes, this man obviously paid attention to health and appearance. Jane was even embarrassed at first. How to start a conversation with someone like that? She suddenly seemed insignificant next to him. "Good morning," Kevin smiled warmly. Jane's embarrassment vanished. The man's smile was open, and the kind Kevin seemed at once like a man of his own. "Hello," Jane smiled back. "I'm here to see you." "That's very good. I'll tell you straight away. I need a carer for my daughter, Melissa. She's in really bad shape right now. So it's not for everyone. She's being monitored by the paramedics. They're here every day. I could hire a nurse for Melissa, but how can I tell you this? There's a lot of pain in her life already, a lot of people in white coats. I wish there was someone else there for her. You know, a young girl like you. Cheerful, who knows a lot of songs and fairy tales, who can cheer up a child, inspire him, come up with some interesting activity, in general, to brighten up her leisure time." "Why? What's wrong with your girl?" Jane just couldn't help but ask the question. Kevin lowered his eyes. His face darkened in an instant, becoming anxious and tense. "Melissa, she's been tested everywhere. No one could figure anything out. It's like her body is destroying itself. There's no sign of autoimmune aggression. She's been getting tests all the time. They do, but she's fading, and nothing helps her." "Poor baby," Jane exclaimed. "The doctors are doing what they can. I have the means, as you can see, but they're not all powerful, unfortunately. Anyway, Melissa needs more than just a nanny. That's where we have Vivian, our favorite au pair. She'll feed her and give her medication on time, and we don't just need a carer either. Melissa has nurses to look after her and do all the necessary treatments. What Melissa needs is more like, a friend or something. Someone who can bring her positive emotions. The doctors say it's very important in her condition. And looking at you, I think you're just that young, beautiful, funny, and you have a kind look in your eye. You know how to empathize. That's good." Jane nodded. She was anxious to see the little girl. She needed positive emotions, and she would give them to her. Jane would cheer up a girl who had such a serious illness, brighten up the gray, everyday life of the little patient, find a way to make her life more pleasant. "If you're ready to get to work right now," Kevin continued, "let's start a trial period. Let's say 3 days, and then it's up to Melissa to decide. Of course, you'll be paid for your time anyway. Do you agree?" Yes, Jane nodded. "That's good," Kevin said happily. "Then Vivian will introduce you to Melissa. I've got to go, I've got things to do." As the door shut behind Kevin, Vivian, a middle-aged woman with a surprisingly soft and cozy look, turned to Jane with a question. "Have you ever interacted with little kids before? Do you know what little kids are like?" "I have nephews," Jane nodded. "That's good." Vivian shook her head. "Except our Melissa, she's an unusual child. You realize that yourself. I guess Melissa hardly ever gets out of bed. She gets tired quickly. It's hard to keep her interested in anything, but you have to. Melissa needs to be distracted from her pain, from her torment, and she needs to be walked at least an hour a day. That's what the doctors said. I get it." "Well, let's go and meet her now," Vivian said. Jane followed Vivian to the first floor and entered the nursery. It was the princess's spacious room. A huge window let in a lot of daylight. Along the walls were racks of expensive toys and books. Right in the center of the room was a mini playground. There was a slide, swings, and even a trampoline. A little further away was a ball pool, and closer to the door was a bed. What kind of bed was it? It was large, round, with a pink canopy. Jane looked around curiously. She had never seen a room like this before. Was it really all for one child? In the midst of this splendor, Jane did not immediately notice the little mistress of the room. She was lying in bed surrounded by large, soft toys. There was a soft cat, a fluffy white bear, a bright green crocodile with flowers all over its body, and a thin, pale 7-year-old girl, completely transparent and almost blending in with the white bedclothes because of her unhealthy skin color. Huge blue eyes, like her father's, looked at the entrance with curiosity. Melissa propped herself up on her elbows, though it cost her great effort, and turned to Vivienne. "Who's that with you? The new rehab doctor?" The difficult word came off the little girl's lips easily and habitually, and it was somehow completely unnatural. "No, honey, this is your new friend. Her name is Jane. Are you going to play dolls together?" Melissa perked up a little. "Whatever you want to play." Jane smiled at her. The girl was both sympathetic and pitiful. "I really like to play with dolls." "That's good. Vivienne doesn't have time. And Daddy can't play at all," Melissa said. "Grown-ups have a lot to do," Jane shrugged. "That's why they can be boring sometimes." "Right," Melissa suggested. And the conspirators smiled. "Boring," Jane agreed. Melissa laughed softly. "Well, I can see you're going to be fine. You two have fun," Vivienne said. She looked really happy. "I'm going to go make dinner. Oh, and Melissa, you remember the nurse is coming to see you today, right?" I remember. The girl frowned. "More IVs. But where can I go?" Sweet Vivienne kissed the girl on the top of her head and left the room. Jane was left alone with Melissa. "Shall we play?" With a smile, the girl turned to her ward. "You have so many beautiful toys here. I can't keep my eyes open." "Better read to me," the girl asked. The short conversation seemed to have drained her of her energy. Melissa sank down on the pillows and pulled the blanket over her skinny body, even though the room was warm. "Good," Jane agreed. She was surprised at the weakness of this 7-year-old. They seemed energetic, like Andrew, Jane's eldest nephew, who was just the same age as Annie. But you can't get him to sit still for 5 minutes. He's always up to something, making things up. If the boy were in this room, he'd be jumping on a trampoline or going down a slide. Lassie calls him a perpetual motion machine, and so does Lillian. Chris and Chris are the same, even though they're younger. Melissa, on the other hand, poor thing, is lying on her back. "What do you want to read?" "Princesses. There's a book on the windowsill." Vivienne started to read to me. "But she never has time," she said. It was a heavy, beautiful book with bright pictures. But the story itself seemed silly, boring, predictable, and formulaic. She herself did not like such fairy tales in her childhood. "Let's make up our own story about these princesses," Jane suggested. Melissa's tired eyes flashed with interest. "How?" she asked. "Very simple. I start, you continue." Melissa was fascinated by the activity. She was inspired to invent adventures for the princess. She was riding in a racing car. The heroine was kidnapped by a dragon and then rescued by a prince. The girl's imagination was running wild, which seemed to surprise Melissa herself. Then Vivienne entered the room. Seeing that Jane and Melissa were getting along, she was pleased. The woman brought lunch: mashed soup, stewed vegetables. "I don't want any," Melissa said, wincing. "I don't want anything. I don't want any of this." Vivienne looked at Jane, clearly expecting her to help. "Let me feed you," Jane turned to the girl. "Each spoonful is another princess adventure. I'll make them up as I go along. Can you imagine how much I'll have to tell you? Which do you think will finish first, your food or my imagination?" It worked. The food ended faster than Jane's fantasy. But Melissa demanded more stories. Vivienne splayed her hands in surprise, smiled, and walked out. Soon a nurse entered the nursery. Melissa immediately darkened. She was almost asleep. Lunch and history had tired her out. But it was time for treatments. "IVs?" she asked the nurse hopelessly. She nodded sympathetically. "I'll do it quickly. Don't worry, it won't hurt." You'll sleep later, and we'll have tea." Vivian pulled Jane's sleeve. "Aren't you needed here now?" The AU pair led Jane into the spacious kitchen. Smoky cups of coffee and a flavorful cake that looked like it had just come out of the oven were waiting on the table. "You and Melissa are getting along, I see." The woman smiled, looking warmly at Jane. "That's good. Melissa kicked her previous nanny out, but she's taken to you. I've already called Kevin and told him all about it. He's very pleased and excited. He said to keep you safe." "I'm glad too." Jane smiled. "Melissa is just too bad. My nephews are so noisy, so cheerful, and she's lying in bed, not even able to play, nothing to play with. It's scary." "What do the doctors say? Are there any chances?" "No prognosis." Vivian shook her head. "They can't even diagnose her. They just dismiss the symptoms, that's all. Melissa's going to be better after the drip. You can take her for a walk after her afternoon nap for a while." Vivian continued her story. "Kevin, Melissa's father, I understand. Where's her mum?" "On a business trip. Does she have a demanding job too, so she can't babysit her daughter?" Vivian sighed. I wish. Lassie, Melissa's mum, isn't alive. The birth was complicated. The doctors tried to save the baby and didn't realize the mother needed help. And Lassie wasn't complaining about anything, just worried about the baby. That's how it all worked out. The day after the birth, Lassie developed a high fever. Checkups, intensive care, one thing led to another. Her heart stopped. Poor thing had some kind of internal bleeding. It's a rare case. And then there was Melissa in the NICU because she was born prematurely. It was a tough time. "It's a shame," I agreed. "That's a shame." "Let me tell you the whole story," Vivian said. "It looks like you're going to be with us for a while, so you should know. Kevin grew up in a happy, full family. A loving mom and dad, caring, attentive grandparents. A room of his own. Trips to the seaside every summer, birthdays. Friends. Kevin had a happy childhood, no less happy youth. He graduated from high school with honors. Thanks in large part to parents who cared about their son's education. If they saw gaps, they immediately hired Kevin the best tutors. And the boy studied English in foreign camps. He had a holiday and got an education at once. Vouchers to such places were not cheap, and it was not easy to get them. But what can't you do for the sake of your favorite son, especially if he is so desirable and long-awaited? Kevin's parents were old enough, they had not been able to have a child for many years. The couple resigned themselves to such a fate. But then, when there was no hope left, life suddenly gave them a surprise, finally gave them an heir. Needless to say, since then, all the attention of his mother and father indiscriminately belonged to Kevin. He was never shy of his parents, despite the fact that they were much older than the parents of his classmates. But Kevin, on the contrary, was proud of his parents. His father was a well-known businessman in the city, and his mother was the head doctor of a regional hospital. They were known and respected by everyone. It never occurred to Kevin to be ashamed of his parents. Kevin grew up. His parents were rapidly aging, giving up. When the guy was in his third year of university, his father died. Stroke, intensive care, coma, and that was it. Kevin felt like an adult for the first time. After all, he, a student, had to get into the affairs of the company, which his parents left him by inheritance. Since he was a teenager, Kevin had been interested in his father's business. He knew a lot of things, even had the right to sign. Yet for the first time, he had entrusted most of the processes to the board manager, a longtime friend of his departed parent. Because Kevin needed to study and support his mother, who had given up a lot after the death of her spouse. 3 years passed. Kevin had just received his diploma, had just taken over his father's company, had just started to gain strength. And then there was another blow, Mum this time. The boy was left all alone. Kevin felt miserable and lonely in his parents' big house. It was good that Vivian, the au pair and almost a member of the family, was there. She had known Kevin as a baby and treated him as her son. The woman had no children of her own. She gave all her care to the young man who had lost both his parents one after the other. "It's been hard on him," Vivian shook her head. "He was just a boy, and here he was. It was his job that pulled him through. He had to make decisions, go places, hold meetings, sign contracts, that sort of thing. That's what saved him." It's been a while. Kevin turned from a young, inexperienced guy into an intelligent, purposeful man, a talented businessman. Vivienne was pleased to see her mentee. He had grown older, stronger, more self-confident. The au pair wished Kevin would find a good wife, marry her, and become a father. Then Vivienne's heart would be at peace. Only he didn't have anyone special. Vivienne said no. There were some girls hanging around Kevin. He was a prominent, wealthy bloke. They're always popular. Except that one of them didn't work out, and he didn't feel anything for the other. They weren't to his heart's content. And Vivienne didn't trust them. It seemed like all they wanted from him was money. They made eyes at him. And then Lassie showed up. Kevin met Lassie literally on the street. She was in a hurry to get somewhere, as it turned out later, for a job interview at Kevin's firm. Lassie had recently been downsized. The factory where she had worked as an accountant for several years after college had suddenly closed. So Lassie was looking for a new position. Kevin went out for a walk to get some air. He even had a goal to buy donuts at the bakery around the corner. And then fate collided the two men, literally. Lassie jumped out of the corner too quickly and ran into the unsuspecting Kevin. It was like a romantic music video. The bag slipped off Lassie's shoulder, its contents scattering across the pavement. Kevin and Lassie rushed to pick it up. The girl apologized. Kevin assured her it was all right and admired the stranger's beautiful gray eyes. It was love at first sight. When the young people had sorted out the bag and the things that had fallen out of it, they rose synchronously and smiled at each other. Kevin, like a man, made the first move. He learned the name of the beautiful stranger and then introduced himself. They walked leisurely and talked, getting to know each other. When Kevin found out that Lassie was rushing to his office, he realized that this beautiful girl was his destiny. And it was no accident that they met in such an interesting way, rather than seeing each other for the first time in the office. It was more romantic, more interesting, more pleasant. In short, it was a real romance. Vivienne had never seen Kevin so happy. Lassie turned out to be intelligent, understanding, kind. She quickly found a rapport with Vivienne too, which was important. Sweet, sweet girl. And for what? And just such a fate. Vivienne shook her head sadly. A couple of years after they met, Kevin and Lassie got married. It was a wonderful couple, harmonious and happy. There was love, understanding, and respect between the couple. Vivienne rejoiced when she saw them together, her beloved Kevin and his wonderful, beautiful wife. They decided not to rush into having children. Vivienne continued. It was their common decision. It was like they felt something. They traveled, worked, met friends. And I, the fool, was advising them in my senile way not to delay it. I wanted to babysit their baby. But Kevin and Lassie lived on their own for 5 years after they got married. Were they happy together? No, they wanted kids, but not right away, later, until they were happy. And then the news of Lassie's pregnancy. It was an unplanned event, but the whole household welcomed it. Well, it's about time, Lassie summarized. The baby decided he'd had enough of waiting. Thank God. Vivienne shook her hands. I think you're going to have a boy. You look so pretty now, Lassie. Girls take beauty from their mothers when they're pregnant. But the au pair was wrong. The ultrasound confirmed that Lassie was having a girl. A healthy, strong one. They showed me a picture of her. They take pictures of a baby in the womb nowadays. I looked at her, and she looked just like Lassie. That's how Melissa was born, just like her mom. Melissa. It was Lassie who chose the name for her daughter. Kevin and Vivienne didn't mind. They both liked it very much. The pregnancy hadn't been easy. At first, Lassie was suffering from toxicosis, then it seemed to recede, but it was replaced by other problems: high blood pressure, edema. The child developed well, but the mother suffered, melting before her eyes, refusing to eat, lying down a lot. The usually energetic Lassie didn't even have the strength to go downstairs. Vivienne carried her food straight to her bedroom. The woman felt sorry for Lassie, helped her as much as she could, and assured her that things would not be easy after the birth of her daughter. Children are for women, Vivienne sighed. Pregnancy had taken its toll on Lassie. That depends. Jane shrugged, remembering her sister. Her children had been relatively easy. Anyway, Lassie had gone into labor much earlier than expected. The threat of miscarriage had been diagnosed throughout the pregnancy, so fortunately the mother-to-be was in the hospital under the supervision of doctors at that moment. They tried to stop the process, but failed. Melissa was born premature, weak. She didn't scream. She wasn't put on Lassie's chest. She wasn't even shown to her. Things are different when it comes to newborns who need to stay in the womb for at least 3 more months. Melissa was immediately sent to the NICU. There was a fight for her life. And Lassie seemed fine at first. I mean, she was tired, of course, after giving birth. Well, she was worried about her daughter. She was worried sick. It's all understandable. Understandable and natural, Vivian said. The doctors examined the woman in labor, found no abnormalities, and sent her to the ward. It was only later that serious symptoms appeared, but it was too late. Kevin and I were worried about the girl, Vivian said, almost crying. It was obvious that even now, 7 years later, it was hard for her to remember it. We thought the baby wouldn't survive. She was born too early. She was too weak. And then, when in the morning Kevin received a call from the hospital and was told that his wife had died of internal bleeding, he could not believe his ears. He thought it was Melissa. His mind refused to accept what he was hearing. But no, Melissa had pulled through. She was a stronger girl. But Lassie was gone. Kevin went gray, didn't sleep or eat for months. I thought he'd gone too. Vivian stopped talking. But he did. I had work to do, Melissa to pull. To be honest, he hadn't been very good to his daughter at first. Vivian blamed Lassie for what happened to her. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't help it. She was just angry with her. Melissa was discharged home and a nanny was hired for her. Someone had to look after the baby. Vivian was too old for that. But she enjoyed playing with the girl. Melissa took her around the yard in her prom and talked to her a lot. And she was the only one who gave the newborn the love she needed. My father wasn't capable of that at the time. She's like a granddaughter to me, the au pair smiled. I took to her right away. But Kevin. He shunned the child for a long time, bought everything he needed for her, and sometimes went for a walk with her. But that was if Vivian made him. He never took the initiative. Then one day Melissa got sick, high fever. Nothing helped. She was vomiting, poor thing. It was the flu. A lot of people got it back then, and the little ones took it particularly badly, Vivian said. But anyway, Melissa was back in hospital again. The doctors had no prognosis. And that's when Kevin came to his senses, dropped everything. He sat by his daughter's bedside 24 hours a day, singing songs to her, telling her poems, rocking her in his arms. And it was as if Melissa felt her father's care. She was on the mend immediately. Their little girl was discharged, and Kevin became completely different with her, a real father, loving and caring. Life went on as usual. Kevin worked hard, but always found time to spend with his daughter. Melissa grew up, pleased her father and Vivian with her excellent health and rare intelligence, and everything seemed to be fine. Except that Vivian was worried that Kevin was all alone. It seemed to her that he would not be happy until he met a woman. Only now it was a very difficult task. For Kevin's chosen one, she had to love and accept Melissa. Otherwise, any union was out of the question. Well, God has heard my prayers, Vivian smiled. And Kevin had a beautiful Samantha. I can't take my eyes off her. Smart too. She's got a kid herself, a little girl a little younger than Melissa. It's a great family. Samantha got a job with Kevin, and it all started at some corporate event. It's pretty standard stuff. Samantha was good to Melissa. She often took her and her youngest daughter out to an amusement park or to the cinema. Melissa grew to love both Samantha and her little half-sister Annie. She was truly happy. Kevin and Samantha got married and started living together, and then Annie started having these symptoms. First dizziness, then nausea, weakness, no appetite. Examination in the best clinics, trips to doctors abroad, consultations of famous professors, all this did not give any result. Doctors could not make the correct diagnosis. The girl was melting before our eyes. The first year she was still fine. She was still on her feet. Vivian almost cried again. It was obvious that her heart was truly hurting for the little girl. After New Year's Eve, she was quite ill. and now I am so frightened for her. I don't know what kind of illness has attacked our little girl." Samantha and her daughter moved into her flat temporarily. Annie was in daycare, and it was too dangerous for Melissa to get infections from there. So Samantha and Kevin made that decision. "And it comes from Samantha a lot. Every day almost," Vivian continued. "She's a good girl. She brings Melissa fair gifts. She brings Annie some too when she's not sick. But when she went to the garden, it started. Sick day after sick day. So it turns out they have a wife with one child separately, the husband with the eldest daughter separately. Such a family. Well, where to go? That's the situation." "It's a strange situation," Jane said. She was shocked by Kevin and Melissa's story. "It's like a TV show. Well, that's just the way it is." The older woman waved her hands. "Melissa, I see she's getting along with you, and that's good," she said. "Everything will be nicer now." Days went by. Jane now lived in the room next to Annie's nursery, but the girl often asked Nanny to stay the night in her bedroom. Melissa had a very comfortable sofa there. Jane made herself a bed on it. They talked before bedtime, holding hands. Jane saw Melissa's problems. It was very important. The girl clearly lacked attention, even though there were many adults around her. Kevin was a very caring and anxious father, a pleasant man to be around. They often had conversations about Melissa. The man always listened attentively to Jane, did not interrupt or argue, asked the right questions. Jane also got to know Samantha. Vivian was right. Indeed, she was a very beautiful woman. Chiseled cheekbones, beautifully curved lips, the grace of a panther, a true queen. But when Samantha interacted with Melissa, when she adjusted Melissa's blanket, smiled and stroked her head, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was a hypocrite. It was evident in seemingly insignificant details as well. A cold glint in her eyes, a squeamish movement of her lips, something elusive and very unpleasant. One day Jane had a strange dream. The girl found herself in some room, ragged wallpaper, creaky floors. She sat on a stool by a dark window, through which nothing could be seen, and realized that she was asleep. She wanted to wake up, but for some reason she couldn't. And then Jane did not even realize where she had come from. Lassie appeared as if out of thin air. Jane recognized her because she had seen Melissa's mother in pictures. Lassie smiled sadly and looked at Jane with a warm and very soft gaze. "Watch her," she said in a quiet, illogical voice. "Watch out for Samantha. She's the trouble. She's dangerous." Lassie vanished into thin air. And Jane had so many questions she wanted to ask her. Watch her how? What? Was she dangerous? Jane woke up in a cold sweat. Or rather, as if Jane had flown into her body, fallen into it. It was a strange sensation. Lassie's words were still echoing in her head. No, Jane didn't believe in the supernatural. But the dream, which was little more than a dream, was more like a journey through time and worlds. The strange dream just wouldn't let go. The next day Samantha was gone, and Jane waited for her. She knew for sure this woman was involved in something bad. Samantha is somehow hurting this family and doesn't like Melissa. She doesn't sympathize with the girl, she just pretends to care. And how come the others don't notice this? Even the experienced, long-lived Vivienne. Samantha turned up the next day, as beautiful as ever, brightly colored, languid. First thing she did was go up to Annie's to say hello. Then she went down to the kitchen. "Melissa's thirsty," Samantha said, looking at Vivienne. "Let me make her some cocoa." "Come on," said the au pair, fussing. "No, I can manage. I feel like it. I want to do something for her." "You're so thoughtful." Jane was silent. She watched Samantha like Lassie had asked her to in the dream. Somehow it felt like this was the big moment. It was as if Lassie were there, telling her to be vigilant. Vivienne was tinkering with the test. Jane pretended to look out the window, but she was watching Samantha. And there she was, the woman deftly pulled a small vial from her sleeve, dripped a few drops into the milk, and immediately hid the bottle back. Only a couple of seconds, a few deft movements, but Jane saw everything. "The drink for the princess is ready." Samantha smiled. "Jane, hand me her favorite cup, please." Jane obeyed. She watched in silence as Samantha poured cocoa into Melissa's mug with a picture of Melissa's favorite cartoon characters, and realized Melissa shouldn't drink it. She shouldn't. She should act on it. Jane pretended to slip. She bumped into Samantha, who dropped the cup out of her hands, the mug falling and shattering. Cocoa spilled on the floor? I'm sorry, I'm so clumsy. Jane fidgeted, grabbed a rag, started wiping up the puddle, picking up the shards. It's okay, I'll do it again. Samantha's voice was filled with poorly concealed irritation. Jane couldn't do it a second time. It would arouse suspicion. So she had to accept the fact that Melissa would get the cocoa from her stepmother's hands. While Samantha and Vivian were at Melissa's, Jane squeezed the rag she used to wipe the cocoa into an empty tomato paste jar. She was going to take the liquid to be analyzed today. She needed to know exactly what Samantha had put in the cocoa. Maybe it was just vitamins. Then there was no point in panicking. But something told her it wasn't. She had to wait 2 days for the test results. When Jane saw the statement, she was horrified. The drink contained poison, deadly, causing symptoms similar to those of Annie. So the girl's weakness was due to her stepmother systematically poisoning her. Just like in a fairy tale. Jane didn't know who to turn to with her news. Vivian? What could she do? Kevin? He wouldn't believe her. What do we do? Samantha can't be allowed anywhere near the girl. She wants to send her to the afterlife, and she's almost succeeded in that endeavor. Still, Jane plucked up the courage to talk to Kevin. She told him everything about her terrible dream, about the cocoa, and about the examination. Jane was afraid that he would shout, start to kick her out, or accuse her of wanting to hurt his daughter. You know, Kevin said, looking at Jane, I'd probably fire you right away if you'd said that. It's very strange, agreed. But just yesterday I had an unusual dream too, Lassie. And she asked me to trust you, just trust, nothing more. Why don't you just keep this to yourself for now and take some time off? I need to sort this out. Vera Antonovna will call you when you can go back to work. Jane spent those few days on pins and needles. She didn't know what was going on at Kevin's house, and she was very worried about Melissa, who had already grown fond of her. But Kevin had said to wait for the call, so she would wait. Vera Antonovna called. Jane, seeing her name on the screen, became anxious. What would they tell her now? How did it go? Come over, was all Vera Antonovna said. We have such a thing here. Come quickly. Melissa misses you. Very much. Jane didn't have to beg long. Half an hour later, she was at Kevin's house. The owner opened the door, still as calm and unruffled as ever. It was hard to guess from his appearance what had happened. I want to thank you. The man finally allowed himself to smile. You were right. Samantha, she really wanted to. I'm afraid to say it out loud. That bastard wanted to poison Melissa? Vera Antonovna shook her head. You'd have to think. And I trusted her so much. The story turned out to be banal and as old as the world. Samantha was not going to put up with a rival in the form of her wealthy husband's favorite daughter. She wanted her own daughter Annie to be the sole heir to Kevin's fortune. Well, herself first, of course. Samantha had once trained as a pharmacist, but she never worked a day in her profession, preferring to live off rich admirers. Nature has generously endowed her with beauty, so that the opportunities for such an existence the woman had. Received in college knowledge was enough to think of a way to send the hated stepdaughter to the other side of the world. A poison that's hard to find in blood and tissue unless you look for it. Samantha put the toxic substance in the food she cooked for Melissa. And the girl was weakening, slowly fading away. We were only a short distance away from the target. It's mind-boggling. It's unbelievable. Vera Antonovna could not calm down yet. Jane understood her. Indeed, Samantha's act was monstrous. How could she do such a thing to a defenseless child? Melissa trusted her, loved her. So Kevin installed surveillance cameras in the kitchen. It turns out Samantha was poisoning Melissa's food every time she ate it. Sometimes she cooked something for the girl herself, and sometimes she'd drip it from a vial into the food, probably prepared by the housekeeper. I used my own hands to take it to Melissa. The poisoned Vivian shook her head. Anyway, Samantha had been caught red-handed. She was under investigation. Annie was taken in by her father, a man who had wanted to have contact with the child for a long time, but he wasn't allowed to because he was too poor for it, too unworthy. Melissa, and everything will be fine, Vivian assured Vivian. It wasn't the child's fault that his mother wanted to do this. And Melissa, how is she? Jane asked. Melissa's fine. Came from somewhere behind her. Jane turned round and met Melissa's eyes. She was still very thin and pale, but she already had the strength to walk around the house. A real miracle. The doctor said she'll recover quickly now. Vivian smiled. Jane and Jasper walked slowly along the shelves of the children's shop. It was the girls' section, so they both felt as if they were in a realm of pink and purple dolls, cosmetics, soft toys. It was mind-boggling. When I was in San Francisco, a guy bought his nephew a voice-controlled robot. That's the stuff. Maybe Melissa would like something like that, Jasper suggested. She's a girl, Jane reminded him. And she definitely wants a doll, a cartoon character. We should try to find one. Maybe next birthday she won't want toys at all. Kids grow up so fast. It's amazing. We'll soon see for ourselves. Jasper put his hand on Jane's rounded belly. The baby responded immediately with a still weak but palpable push. A year ago, right after Melissa had been rescued from her evil stepmother, Jane had been in for another surprise. She continued to live next door to Melissa. She was quickly on the mend, mastered active games, asked to take her for walks all over Los Angeles. The girl was still very attached to Jane, and she still needed a job. And Jane had already got used to everyone to the girl Vivian. Even Kevin did not want to part with them. The adults had initially decided not to tell Melissa the truth about what had happened to her. Too terrible story. But the sensible girl managed to put two and two together, heard something, thought of something herself. It's just like in fairy tales. The girl shrugged her shoulders. The little girl was coming back to life. In September, she went to school with her peers, and Jane was finally able to return to the university, chose a correspondence course, because she had to not only study, but also work. However, her work was more like life in a family with relatives: sweet, cheerful Melissa, kind, wise Vivian, always busy, but polite and attentive Kevin. With these people, Jane was cozy, warm, and comfortable. They accepted her and were very grateful to her for saving Melissa. It's scary to think what could have happened if it hadn't been for that terrible dream. They discussed this unusual event. First, Lassie had dreamt about Jane, then Kevin. Vivian was sure of it. Lassie had broken through time and space to save her little girl. Kevin only shook his head and didn't offer an opinion. And Jane? She didn't know what to think. Perhaps Samantha had aroused her suspicions right away. After all, she hadn't liked Melissa's stepmother at first sight. More likely, Jane ran the thoughts through her head. It was possible that they'd been transformed into unusual dreams. Except Kevin had dreamed about Lassie too and asked him to believe Jane. That afternoon, Jane left the house alone. Melissa was studying. Vivian was doing chores around the house. Jane had to drive to the university to drop off some papers at the dean's office. Suddenly, Jasper stepped towards her. Jane couldn't believe her eyes. The sight of him made the hair on her head stand on end. And him? He looked happy and confused, smiling, looking at Jane as if there were no one more important to him in the world. "I found you at last," he said, and he held her close to him. Jane understood nothing, but she did not resist. She snuggled against the man she loved, enjoyed his closeness, and tried not to think of Jasper's betrayal, of his sudden disappearance. The explanation turned out to be ridiculously simple. Jasper simply dropped his phone into the ocean during a boat trip. Naturally, the gadget disappeared irretrievably. Jane wasn't registered on social media, so he simply couldn't contact her. No way. Jasper wrote letters like the old days, letters and telegrams. But Jane had moved in with Kevin and was hardly ever home. So the letters piled up in the letterbox and then somehow disappeared. "I remember this moment," Jane said. "I came home one day and saw that the letterbox door was broken. Someone had opened the box and taken the letters for some reason. Maybe kids? Maybe a nosy neighbor. In short, you never heard from me, so you thought I'd forgotten about you. Started a new life," betrayed Jasper continued. "I couldn't just drop everything and leave. It was about my career and our future, our well-being. It was unbearable without you, without news of you. But I knew I would have to wait, and then I would be financially secure for many years to come. And then I could fly to you and explain everything. I didn't realize how much trouble you were in. I didn't know you had to take out a loan. I didn't know anything about you quitting your job. It's been so hard on you. That's it. Just an unfortunate coincidence. Jane was glad that her feelings and Jasper's were real, that there was no betrayal or deceit in her life. Just a misunderstanding that had finally been resolved. Jasper now had a contract with a well-known producer in the capital. He had everything he dreamed of: concerts, gigs, tours, opportunities to take his music to people who were ready to accept it. And money. Money, of course. Jasper had even managed to buy a flat for the two of them. It was in the middle of a renovation. Jasper and Jane were married. They were already expecting a child. Jane felt happy and loved. She didn't work for Kevin anymore. And a stronger, more mature Melissa didn't need a 24-hour nanny. But they were all still friends. And right now, Jane and Jasper were picking out a 9th birthday present for Melissa that might not have been. "Your son is your responsibility now," said the daughter-in-law to her mother-in-law. If she only knew. Hospital corridor. An old man with greenish tiles looked into my eyes. From the daylight lamp, long children stretched out their thoughts. The ceiling echoed in their temples. Amanda fidgeted nervously with the bracelet on her arm. She walked back and forth along the corridor, adding the clatter of her heels to the sunset of the lamps. She sat down, trying to calm down, then jumped up again. The doors of the operating theater rustled and creaked lightly. A doctor stepped out of them. Amanda jumped up again, looking hopefully at the medic. "Doctor, please don't be silent." She folded her arms across her chest in a pleading gesture. "The chances are 50-50, the doctor finally said, tightening the mask on her chin. "That she'll get out of the pram." Amanda sobbed sorrowfully again. "You have to believe in the best." The doctor tried to cheer up the girl. He was still young, he would recover. And I wanted to believe in the best. Of course, Amanda was worried about her husband's health, but she was more concerned about the loss of the family's main income and the question of who would provide for them now. Edgar rode out of the corridor to meet his wife returning from work. Amanda was not in a good mood. Lately, it had become a constant state for her. She had to get up early, work, do household chores, and still care for her disabled husband. "How was your day?" Edgar asked, taking the bag from the girl. "Disgusting," Amanda said sharply, taking off her coat. Edgar left for the kitchen. He was quite brisk with the pram and could even boast some mobility, if it could be called that. The man moved the bag of groceries to the floor near the refrigerator and began to open the door. He could only put his purchases on the first shelf or the bottom of the door. Amanda snatched the bottle of milk she'd opened on the way out, slammed it down and closed it loosely. It wouldn't leak to the neighbors. "Why are you shouting?" Edgar looked at her. "Would someone wipe it up?" "You." Amanda felt irritated and developed from her husband's helpfulness. He realized his limited functionality, so he tried not to inconvenience his wife. At first, Edgar was even ashamed, but later he accepted his condition and stopped suffering from remorse. "Can you heat it up for yourself?" "I'm tired." Amanda pulled her hair back with her hands and went into her room. The couch creaked faintly. Bleck the cat rubbed against her leg, begging for a treat. Amanda sat relaxed, exhausted, lethargic, and powerless. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd married the handsome extreme sportsman Edgar. Now he's deprived of his passion and his income. And she has to work for two, running all over town showing cheap flats to poor families. This was not how Amanda planned to spend her youth. Her husband had been in a wheelchair for 6 months. At first they lived on old savings, but those soon ran out. Amanda put off looking for a job until the last minute. She was scared, and her inner state was against it. By the age of 25, the girl had no experience. She worked part-time shooting for online clothing shops, blogging for a young stylist, although she had a good education in the hospitality industry. From the first days, real estate work seemed to Amanda to be useless, incomprehensible payment, running around, a lot of calls, the need to persuade someone to travel to the objects. What kept the girl in such an unloved place? Charming director and owner of the agency, Michael. He appeared there rarely, but every time it happened, in the office began a semblance of scenes from the film office romance. All the few female staff began to intensively put themselves in order to correct makeup, hairstyles, check manicures, and it was done by both very young girl students, working part-time in their spare time, and an elderly accountant, Cassandra. Amanda, too, fell under Michael's spell, and the more time passed, the wider the gap between her and Edgar grew. She stopped believing in the doctor's prognosis, and it was a thankless task to take a chance. But here he was, next to her, a living, handsome man, Michael. Though not hers yet, but it was only a matter of time. Such thoughts daily swarmed the girl's head. There was a constant struggle between duty, feelings, selfishness, and conscience. And that evening, selfishness and inner whims won. At some point, Amanda realized that she didn't care at all about the opinion of others, that she didn't want to support her invalid husband until his retirement and cross out her whole life with it. She too deserves happiness, deserves the joy of being a girl, not to pull a heavy burden on herself. The decision came instantly. It was strange that such a momentous turn was made on an ordinary sofa in an ordinary city flat on an ordinary March evening. "Are you going somewhere?" Edgar asked, watching his wife pack a pile of things into her bag. "Yes," Amanda nodded briefly. "We're going to your mum's." Edgar raised an eyebrow in surprise and grinned with the corner of his mouth. "What kind of nonsense is that? A daughter-in-law wants to go to her mother-in-law's house by herself. The daughter-in-law is tired of working for two." Amanda threw Edgar's trainers into the bag with a swift throw. The man fell silent, and Amanda just burst into tears. "I can't do this anymore, okay? I can't. I'm beautiful, I'm young, I want romance. I want a decent man by my side, I want care and affection, not to look after an invalid." "Amanda." "I'll get out of the wheelchair," Edgar interrupted her. "The doctors said there was a chance." "Maybe you won't. I'm sick of this." Amanda threw in her bag a couple more t-shirts and zipped it up with a precise motion. "Are you staying at your mum's? We need to live apart for at least a few months. 6 months." "I don't know." They were both silent. Amanda was dumbfounded. Edgar realized that he was being thrown away like an unnecessary thing. Really, what good is such a helpless and useless husband? "And aren't you afraid to hang close to the ground when you're lying on that mattress?" Mate Terrence shoved Edgar in the shoulder, barely landing. "Fear the wolf," the man grinned, laying the foam on the grass so that he could gather it up without getting tangled in the slings. Edgar and Terrence had been taking tourists on extreme tours to the mountains, the Alaska range, for 5 years. The guys had tried everything that could tickle the nerves and make the flesh shake. Rafting, jumping rope, quad biking, long-distance hiking, mountaineering. But Edgar's greatest passion was paragliding. He spent almost the whole summer in the mountains. He flew, tried, learnt, got bumps, wiped his knees on landing. Once he dislocated his elbow, caught his paraglider on a tree, and fell from a height of a couple of meters to the ground. The air of freedom and the glamour of the mountains beckoned the stubborn lad, who flew where others were afraid to go, and stayed under the clouds for so long that his fingers went numb from the cold. Edgar started riding tourists when he was already convinced of his own skill. So the guys worked. Terrence was the driver and organizer. Edgar was the coordinator and implementer of extreme entertainment. For 6 months they earned so much that the remaining 6 months could not work at all. But they didn't. They simply changed the style of traveling, and instead of paragliding, they went snowboarding and skiing with tourists. "Oh dear, finish that stuff you're doing. If you fall from that height, you won't pick up any bones." His mother Cassandra shook her head. But the boy liked to live like that. It was 100 times better than sitting in a stuffy office poking at buttons. Dangerous? So what? It's dangerous to sneeze in a public place these days. So what are we supposed to do? Not go out? Of course not. You've got a great education. Go to the bank, make a career. Mother wouldn't stop. Will the children go to the mountains too? No wife, no kids either. Mom, why are you bothering again? Edgar sighed tiredly. The parent was in her repertoire. Talking about the dangers of paragliding and the frivolity of the tourist business was a regular occurrence. even if it brought in decent money. Edgar met Amanda on a social network. He was bored on a winter evening. The guy scrolled through the newsfeed and came across the page of a pretty girl. Something about this brunette caught the young man's eye. Word by word, they went on a couple of dates. The girl was impressed by Edgar's boldness and passion. He took her on several trips, even offered to take her paragliding. But Amanda refused the altitude. Everything spun quickly, and in less than 6 months he proposed to her. Edgar was not embarrassed that the chosen one is spoiled, somewhat capricious, ambitious. But she always waited at home, cooked delicious salads and dishes, did not criticize his hobbies. At work, Edgar's wife did not kick out the wife. "Let her do what she likes," he said to his mother. "I earn enough for 2. At least she's always beautiful and fresh." Amanda was more than happy with this arrangement. She was already dreaming of a full-service travel agency, of a house somewhere by the sea, of her own column in some fashion magazine. Life went on at its own pace. Edgar and his wife lived a year and a half. Her mother gave the young couple her 2-room flat, and she bought a small house in the countryside outside the city on her savings and moved in, but on the condition that soon there would be grandchildren. Edgar guffawed. Amanda rolled her eyes. Children were not in her plans for the next 100 years. But it wasn't necessary to upset Cassandra to know that. Instead of children, Amanda suggested that her husband get a Spitz. Edgar didn't mind and promised that after the next tour they would go together to a breeder and choose a puppy. A happy Amanda stayed home in anticipation, and Edgar and Terence took the tourists to the mountains. Edgar had been warned by everyone that his fascination with flying would not end well. But fate had other plans. The return trip in the mountains fell on rainy weather. In late August, Terence drove the minibus with the group, carefully slowing down on the serpentine corners. Edgar was dozing in the front passenger seat, tired from the busy program and the early rise. It all happened in a split second when a dashing local jigger in his car sped out of the corner and into the oncoming traffic. Terence swerved to the side to avoid the collision. The minibus tipped on its side and slammed into a pole and a concrete barrier. Edgar was literally squeezed in half between the roof and the dashboard. The other passengers were crushed like peas, but fortunately no one else was seriously hurt. They were just abrasions, bruises, contusions, and a couple of broken fingers. Terence dislocated his arm and suffered a concussion. Breathless Edgar was pulled out by rescue personnel only 40 minutes later. In the mountains in the rain and traveling fast is not even possible for rescuers. He was taken to the nearest hospital, but there was no one there to perform the complicated operation. The man was rushed to the state capital. There he could be given at least a chance to get back on his feet. The operation was a success. Edgar recovered quickly, but he was paralyzed from the waist down. Without words, it was clear that extreme sports were over for good, extreme sports and his favorite job. The minibus was beyond recovery. The firm was ruined. It was left without transport and its chief instructor. Amanda howled wolf as she realized her beautiful, comfortable life was over. Her attitude towards her husband changed almost immediately. Whereas before she had seen him as a hero, a pillar, a leader, a risk-taker, now he was just a source of trouble. Edgar experienced the crisis of loss of mobility for a long time. He became depressed. 10 times a day he revisited photos from his trips, pulled the remains of his parachute out of his rucksack, stroked it, holding it in his hands, sighing, staring at one point. The atmosphere in the flat was heavy. The doctor prescribed Edgar a set of exercises that should have had an effect over time. But the man, disgusted by his helplessness, could not start doing them for a long time. Amanda avoided talking about the accident and didn't poke her husband's nose in his deficiency at first. But as the irritation and strain grew, she sometimes snapped. "Don't be discouraged, son. Believe in the best, and do not give up therapeutic gymnastics called to raise morale only Mother Cassandra." Terence, who had recovered, came to visit occasionally. But it was hard for him to talk about what he had lost. As time passed, the former paraglider gradually heeded the doctor's advice and began to exercise occasionally. Just as Amanda began to think about divorce. Amanda had a breakdown at work. It was a frosty morning in the village. Clusters of rowan berries, covered in hoarfrost like earrings, adorned a bald bush. A flock of sparrows hopped in it with a cheerful chirp. Frost covered the ground. Amanda opened the gate and rolled the pram down the narrow path to the porch. Cassandra popped out of the door wearing a down shawl. The two women pulled the pram into the hay. "How long are you visiting, Amanda?" the mother-in-law asked, shaking an invisible speck off her son's jacket. "Edgar, for a long time." "I'm going back to town. I have work to do," Amanda replied briefly. Before Cassandra could even open her mouth, her daughter-in-law hurriedly said goodbye, slammed the door shut, and took a taxi back to catch the train. The women stared at their son in confusion. Edgar was gloomier than a cloud. He had lost his favorite thing, his ability to walk, and now his personal life hung in the balance. A couple of days later, Amanda arrived again. The man was hopeful when he heard the clatter of the wicket outside the windows, but Edgar's joy was too soon. "I've always wanted a dog," Amanda put the carrier with Bill's cat on the floor without even saying hello. The frightened cat huddled in the far corner and mewed hoarsely in fear. Amanda left without even bothering to say goodbye. Edgar felt a little better. The clever animal quickly got used to his new surroundings. The cat often slept on his master's lap while Edgar sat by the window in his pram or outside, breathing fresh air. Sometimes Bleck would jump up and down to catch sparrows in the snow, or hunt for an invisible speck in the dry grass. Edgar loved to watch the pet. It calmed him and drove away his boredom and longing for adventure. 2 months passed. It was the end of March. During that time, Amanda never returned. At first, the man called and wrote to her himself. But as time went on, his wife stopped picking up the phone and answered one-wordedly on social media. Edgar realized that he had been cynically and utterly dispassionately disposed of. Cassandra's mother shook her head and often berated Amanda. Cassandra was especially concerned about the state of the flat her son had left behind. "Good girl," Cassandra lamented. "She left her husband on my neck. She lives in the city in someone else's mansion and doesn't give a damn. Edgar, get a divorce, I'm telling you. And everything will get better. Stop it." The man waved his mother away, but he believed in his own words less and less. Apathy and longing were eating Edgar. He was tormented by his own idleness, because he could not do most of the housework. Walks were rare. Pulling the pram down a couple of porch steps to the ground was hard. Once again, as Cassandra tried to do so, an elderly neighbor, Norman, peered over the fence at her. "Hey Cassandra, what are you going to do? Say you've got him in your arms," shouted the old man in righteous indignation simply. "Hello, Norman," said the woman. "Well, what else could it be? You'd better help than scratch your tongue. The gate is open." The neighbor ran nimbly, not at all senilely, to the pram and helped it down the steps and onto the path to the gate. At the same time, he asked both Edgar and his mother about what had happened. "It's a misfortune." "A misfortune," the man scratched the back of his head, pushing his knitted cap to the side. "And it's not clear whether he'll get up or not." "I'll get up," Edgar mumbled, feeling terribly embarrassed that the two older men had to deal with him. "I've got it." Norman threw up a finger. "I'll come back tomorrow and tell you how to adapt it for the pram. Then you, grandson," he said to Edgar, "can you get in and out? Better get back on your feet, though. Okay?" Edgar smiled a little and sighed. "Norman's not like my grandfather, God rest his soul. A lazy bum," Cassandra exclaimed. "All he knew how to do was stuff holes in socks." The company laughed involuntarily. The neighbor soon left, having inspected the porch beforehand, and Cassandra rolled the pram along the pavement to the shop. Amanda opened her laptop after work, sitting down on the soft couch. She didn't look away from a message from her husband with another question. Camila was interested in something else. Today, Michael, the director of the agency, had finally paid attention to her and invited her to coffee together at lunchtime. It was not for nothing that Camila wore short skirts and spent several hours every morning in front of the mirror. The determination with which Camila moved towards the goal of winning the director was worthy of applause. The girl went with the chief to a coffee shop and made it clear that she would not mind to continue communication in a more informal setting. Michael caught the hint, and at the end of lunch invited the pretty employee to dinner at a restaurant at the end of the week. Camila cheered. "His suit is definitely not from a local tailor," Camila mumbled under her breath, as she looked at her boss's photos on social networking sites, and a decent watch and cufflinks. Her eyes burned with admiration, but more for herself. A month had passed since Camila had put her husband in her mother-in-law's care, and during this time she realized that her life was, in general, not so bad. The work suddenly stopped stressing her. Cooking and cleaning turned into rare worries. There was enough money for herself, and still had time to shoot for clothing catalogs. Sometimes on the mental horizon slipped thoughts of divorce, but so far Camila canceled them. It was necessary to prepare the ground for a run-up, so as not to sit soft place in a puddle. As a calculatingly cunning woman, Camila understood this, and therefore did not hurry. Though Edgar could have served Edgar at any moment. But she would think of something. Yes, and not much believed Camila that kind attached to her Edgar first will go to such a step. The photos of the boss told Camila what she wanted to know. Michael in his 35 years was the owner of a nice house in the suburbs, 2 cars, and clearly had a passion for business things, foreign tailoring. The girl leaned back contentedly on the back of the sofa, scrolling in her head options for outfits for a future date. Her sick husband and the fact that she was legally married did not slow Camila down a bit. She didn't give a damn. X-Day came. Michael picked her up in his car. Since her work in the agency, Camila tried not to spread much about her personal life. She'd taken off her ring right after she'd sent Edgar to the country, and therefore in the car already flirted with her boss, who was 10 years older than her. The girl achieved her goal. In the morning, she woke up in the house of her lover. Michael brought her coffee and asked if the young lady does not want to go to the skating rink. A couple of days later, Camila flirtatiously agreed. Everything went according to plan. She told Michael what he wanted to hear, and he was slipping into an affair with his coworker. At work, they decided not to advertise their relationship, although it was difficult to hide something in a female team. Soon the whole office was talking about the fact that the manager had a young mistress. Camila quietly laughed at the gossiping colleagues, but did not hurry to reveal the secret. Her goal was Michael, not to hurt the noses of her workmates. The first day of April was too warm. It was as if the sun had reached the clear sky and was now eager to make all the plants grow and bloom in one day. There were even some sleepy flies in the air, dazed by the sudden joy of plus 19 degrees. Norman scratched his stubbled chin and held his visor up, looking at the sun. "It's blooming, isn't it?" He nodded to Edgar. The man sat in his buggy on the porch path, keeping his neighbor company while he reworked the sides into a strong and smooth slope. On Edgar's lap, Black the cat stomped around. He was writhing in pain, digging his paws into his master's lap. "Now we'll put some paste on it, and you'll ride like a racer," the elderly neighbor said contentedly, wielding a hammer. "At least we can do it without breaking traffic laws," Edgar smiled. He'd been a little perked up lately. Maybe it was the weather, maybe it was the fact that Amanda had practically abandoned him. Either way, clarity had come. Besides, Edgar had figured out a way to brighten up his hated idleness. He decided to write a book about his journey to paraplegia. He found a blank notebook in his desk and began jotting down ideas. Edgar had never written any texts before, except for essays at school. However, his work was quite vigorous. It was the abundant reading in the winter evenings, as his mother had always favored books and had plenty of them at home. On those same winter evenings, he and his parents, sometimes with neighbors or alone in the kitchen, would read across from each other while drinking herbal tea. At such times, Edgar would forget that he was deprived of the ability to walk and become a little happier. Black stretched his striped back, jumped to the ground, and disappeared behind the fence on some feline business of his own. "It's done." Norman surveyed the job well done, and then turned to Edgar. "Come on, son, try it yourself." Edgar, helping himself with his hands, began to carefully roll the pram up the makeshift ramp. A few minutes later, he and his vehicle were already at the door to the house. "Well, that's good," praised his neighbor. "Grandpa, are you here?" Came from behind the fence. "Let's go to lunch. I boiled some brine soup." Edgar turned his head at that voice, which sounded like the crunch of thin ice on a puddle. A girl in a striped jumper was waving from behind the gate. Her blonde curls were poking out from under her beret, and her bright blue eyes were visible, even at a distance of several meters. "My granddaughter, Elizabeth Norman nodded discreetly to Edgar. "She's in town for the weekend studying. I don't know who she's studying for," said the old man. "Come on, Grandpa, let's go. It's getting cold," the guest stomped her foot demandingly outside the gate. I'm coming. Why are you shouting?" The neighbor waved good-naturedly at her. "I'll go." "Edgar, say hello. I'll see you again. That beam under the roof is bad. It could use a change." Norman gathered the tools in a bag, waved to Edgar, and went out the gate to his granddaughter. The man thanked his neighbor for his hard work and suddenly realized that he couldn't stop thinking about Elizabeth, even though he hadn't even met her. April continued to bring warmth and wind. There were sparse gray-white piles of snow in the flower beds, and among them were sprouts of the first spring flowers sticking out of the ground. Edgar hadn't written to Amanda for a long time, but he was actively working on his book. The second notebook was already written. "Edgar, can you get to the shop by yourself? Are you out of salt?" Mother shouted from the kitchen. "I can't leave. The pies will burn and the soup will run away," Edgar said. The way to the grocery store was simple, a straight asphalt path about 250 meters long, with no steps and no potholes. "I can make it," Edgar said. He hastily put on his jacket, checked the change in his pocket, and rolled toward the gate. Glad that he could help at last, it was time to go for a walk. His mother looked at him from the window. The tires of the pram rustled quietly on the already dry asphalt. Edgar moved slowly, looking at the village. In the gray and dreary winter, it was depressing. But when the sun came out, the carved shutters and skates on the roof shone. In front of the yard's colored borders and future flower beds looked out. Quick sparrows were dragging grain from the chickens' feeders, chirping. Somewhere sheep barked. The noise pleased the heart, heralded the arrival of warmth to people and animals. Edgar got to the shop without any problems, bought salt and rolled back. Almost back to the house, he heard the pitiful, familiar meows from the roof of the neighbors. The man looked up. Bill was sitting on the roof. Edgar had seen from the window that the cat used to climb up there on scaffolding. The neighbors were repairing something in the attic, and the scaffolding had been up there most of the winter. But the repairs were over. The scaffolding was removed so as not to clutter up the flower bed in front of the windows. And the poor cat was trapped. There was no tree nearby, no lower roof, no suitable fence to climb down. Unhappy Bill climbed into the attic to the neighbors, fell asleep there the night before, and in the morning they cleaned up the scaffolding. And now the frightened animals, seeing the owner, shrieked at the top of their voices that the poor man was stuck. "How are we going to film you now?" "That's the problem." Edgar looked questioningly at the pet. He tried knocking and calling the neighbors, but they weren't home. Apparently, Edgar's conscience prevented him from calling his mother. The feeling of helplessness and inferiority came again. The man looked at the pram with dislike. If it hadn't been for her, I'd have climbed over the fence in no time, used the tools I had on hand to get up on the roof, and lowered Bleak down to the ground, he thought. A familiar ringing voice snapped Edgar out of his musings. Norman's granddaughter, Elizabeth, was standing nearby, looking up at the roof. "Yes, I wonder how to get it." Edgar nodded cautiously. "Well, you don't have much to think about," Elizabeth said. "Well, we can't leave the mustache in the lurch." She put the bag of food in Edgar's lap, rolled up her sleeves, and climbed over the fence to the neighbors. The man only clapped his eyes in amazement. The vivacious girl aroused in him a feeling of real admiration. Elizabeth walked round the house and found an old 3-step ladder by the shed. She shook the find happily, showing Edgar that she had an idea. The ladder was low enough to climb onto the roof, but high enough to reach her hands over the edge and grab the cat's paw. The frightened Bill clawed at the girl's hand, meowed, and looked around with bulging eyes. When the animal was on the ground, Elizabeth handed it directly into the hands of its owner, through the hole between the bars of the fence. Then she carefully carried the ladder back to its place and climbed back over the fence, as deftly as she had done the first time. There was no sign of the sudden intrusion. "You made us do a lot of work." She knelt down in front of Edgar and patted the cat's fur affectionately. "Thank you. I don't know how I would have got it myself." Edgar handed the girl a bag of groceries. My name is Elizabeth, by the way she introduced herself. Obviously not, or he would have waited for another kind-hearted passerby. And I'm Edgar. The man smiled slightly. It's a good thing it was you, he said to the passerby. Elizabeth wrinkled her nose. Let's go with you. Why not? It's like we're old acquaintances. I'm just embarrassed, Edgar said. I must be about 10 years older than you. We look the same age, Elizabeth said. How about just being polite? That's right, Edgar agreed. He drove forward a little and stopped at his gate. Let me help you. Elizabeth reached for the handle to open the door so Edgar could drive through freely. She took a careless step and tripped over the curb ledge. The man's reaction was lightning fast. He lunged forward and picked Elizabeth up with his arms. I'm clumsy, she deftly hid her embarrassment behind a laugh. It happens to everyone. It's all right, Edgar played along. Elizabeth, come and have tea with Grandpa Norman. Of course we will. Grandpa said something about the roof. Elizabeth remembered and nodded. She waved goodbye and went on her way. Edgar, for some reason, was as excited as a child. He rolled the pram onto the porch, opened the door to the house, where a hungry Bill immediately ran out. It was only then that he realized what had happened a minute ago. For the first time since the accident, the man felt his legs weakly as he pitched forward. They echoed with a slight tingling in his knees. Amanda stretched out in bed, rays of sunlight falling through the window. The hands on the clock showed around 10. Michael wasn't around, he always left early. Apart from weekends, work was the most important lady in the real estate agency director's life. Amanda was in no hurry to get to work. She was already thinking of quitting in general. She was annoyed that Michael wasn't suggesting it. After all, in fact, they were already in a relationship, and he could also allocate some money for her. When colleagues called with questions about his readiness to show flats to buyers, Amanda always found excuses: illness, fatigue, busyness, urgent trip. If he doesn't offer, then I have to quit, Amanda decided as she waited for the coffee machine to make coffee. She liked Michael's house much better than her husband's flat. It was quiet, spacious, and every little thing was taken care of by a robot Hoover. Dishes are washed by a machine, and everything else is automated to the max. It's also perfectly clean. Once a week, Michael had his house cleaned by a cleaning company. He couldn't stand dirt and piles of junk, and he preferred dry cleaning, where all the clothes were put on a hanger and returned perfectly ironed. Unlike Edgar, he was always on parade, not hanging around with tourists, looking after himself. It all appealed to Amanda. It was the way she'd always wanted to live. That was the level she aspired to. The first part of the plan had already been realized. She'd become the boss's mistress. The next part was to gradually accustom him to her in her personal space. Amanda was already looking ravenously at Michael's second car, calculating whether she needed a fur coat for the next season, and when it would be better to take a holiday. And then, when everything was already taken care of, she would quietly divorce Edgar. The girl's plans were Napoleonic. At work, they began to suspect a connection with the boss when Michael drove her a couple of times. Amanda did not answer the questions, but only joked, rolled her eyes. When it all came out, she wouldn't care. In the meantime, it would be better to keep the affair a secret, at least not to be jinxed. Amanda ate a leisurely breakfast, showered, put on makeup, hailed a taxi, and left the office in full parade. She was sure it would encourage Michael to do something more decisive, such as asking her to move in with him at last. Greetings, Amanda said to the manager, raising an eyebrow in mild amazement. Not for work anymore. She placed the application sheet in front of her. So, are you going freelance or have you already found a better place? The manager asked, putting the application in the folder. You could say that Amanda smiled enigmatically. She didn't bother with the detentions at her former job, hastily picked up her things from her desk, bade a dry farewell to her colleagues, and dashed out into the street. It was amazing the determination Amanda had awakened when the prospect of a relationship with a wealthy man loomed, and how she dreaded being left in poverty with a disabled husband. Amanda drove home, dropped off her belongings from work. Then she called her friend Camilla, and they went shopping together. The enterprising girl decided that a new set of pretty lingerie would soften the news of her dismissal from Michael. In the evening, Amanda met her lover in parade at his home and informed him of her decision. Quit. But why? You didn't seem to be loaded with cases, and you were always paid on time. The man was not naively surprised. Why, Michael? Amanda coquettishly sat on his lap. To spend more time with you. After all, a well-slept, beautiful, satisfied woman is better than a tired working bee, isn't she? Yeah. Well, what makes you think you were? Michael was genuinely perplexed. That's how I felt. Amanda didn't like her lover's reaction. An awkward silence ensued. The man was the first to break it. I wanted to talk to you about the May holidays, too. I thought maybe we could go to the mountains, rent a remote, cozy house. What do you think? The word mountains almost made Amanda cringe. She was fed up with the mountains in her life with Edgar, and therefore quickly catching her face, the girl with the most innocent voice began to dissuade Michael from his decision. Michael, it can still be cold in the mountains. I want to get warm already, you know. She slightly played with her eyebrows. Maybe we should spend a little more and fly to a place where it's already warm enough. Lying on the beach is better than kicking up mud in the woods, don't you think? We could do that, the man agreed and reached for his laptop to look for a suitable offer. Amanda realized she'd won. Edgar was looking forward to the tea party with the neighbors, as if it were some kind of important event. He was also very excited by the return of the weak sensitivity in his legs. Had the hope of flying again risen from the ashes? Or at least to walk with his feet on the grass? Edgar longed for the paraglider, the mountains of his active life. He had buried it all when he got into the pram. But now there was a glimpse of a chance in the darkness that not all was lost. Edgar found the doctor's appointment folder, studied the instructions for physical therapy, and began to slowly exercise. Cassandra even let out a quiet tear of joy as she watched her son exercise. She tried to support him in everything, but not to push or nag him. She realized what Edgar was going through physically and mentally, and so she lagged behind with questions about Amanda, about motivation, about the flat. Time will come on its own, everything will work out as it should, the woman sometimes said to herself in the evenings, tapping her knitting needles against each other. On a warm afternoon in mid-April, Norman and Elizabeth appeared on the doorstep of the house. The landlady invited them in, but the brisk grandfather waved them away, saying that first work, then tea and talk. So he surveyed the edge of the roof and set to work. Cassandra fussed at first, but then waved goodbye and went off to make dumplings. Edgar and Elizabeth set up on the front porch in case the good neighbor needed to fetch tools. That's a great-grandfather you have, Elizabeth, Edgar whispered in the girl's ear. I don't remember my grandfathers. I was a little boy when they were gone. I guess I was lucky. Elizabeth nodded and smiled as she looked at her relative who was hard at work with a hammer. And yes, you're right, my grandfather is a good man. An example for the whole family in hard work and optimism. I can see that, Edgar agreed. Do you look like him? Elizabeth tilted her head slyly and looked down at Edgar. She rested her hand on the wheel of the pram. What is it? She looked at the boy expectantly. Edgar was embarrassed for some reason. His heart was pounding like crazy. This simple and perky student caused in him a feeling similar to the first flight under the dome of a paraglider. You're light, witty, and kind, Edgar said in one breath. Elizabeth felt as if she were experiencing all the words in turn, and then nodded affirmatively, nodded a little pictorially, gave Edgar a playful tap on the shoulder, and laughed. An hour later, vanilla and cherries wafted from the open kitchen window. Cassandra leaned out the door and called out to everyone. Give up that roof, Norman. And you guys, come and eat your dumplings while they're hot. Edgar and Elizabeth were chatting on a bench near the porch and did not even hear the hostess' response at first. You, Cassandra, should have your stomach full of people when you're in the middle of work, the elderly neighbor said, fiddling with his tools. Grandfather, let's not go. It will get cold, Elizabeth said softly. She grabbed the handles of the pram with Edgar and boldly rolled it down the porch to the entrance. Don't do that, will you? I'll do it myself, he protested. Let me take care of you, Lisa giggled but didn't stop. When the two of them went to wash their hands in the back of the house, Cassandra stopped Norman, who was late for the young people, at the threshold and whispered, "There's a flower been bloom." "I can't see it," he mumbled good-naturedly. "Do you take me for an old fool?" The neighbors smiled understandingly. When the whole company was gathered round the table, the plates were already steaming, fresh with jam, homemade dumplings with garden cherries, strong tea and sour cream so thick that a spoon could stand in it. Under the table, Bill grumbled. The cat nosed on one lap or the other, begging for treats. In the end, Elizabeth quietly gave the mustached cat one dumpling. Bill instantly dragged his prey outside with a proud look. "Who is it that feeds the cat from the table?" Cassandra was outraged. "Cassandra, will you send them for a walk as punishment?" Grandpa Norman winked at his granddaughter. Elizabeth and Edgar looked at each other at the same time. "That's right," said the landlady. "The weather's nice, there's no need to sit around. Go and pick a bunch of flowers. The goose meadow has already appeared. There's a whole meadow behind the village by the pond, and there's a path for the pram, just enough for Edgar to get through." After the meal, Elizabeth and Edgar, sensing a trick, but not seeing it, were outside the gate of the house and moved leisurely along the path. "Can't you walk at all?" "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked that. It's inappropriate." "It's okay," Edgar answered very calmly. "The doctors say there's a chance, but I can't walk yet." At the same time, he remembered the tingling in his knees. He had recently started doing his own exercises, gymnastics, to restore sensation. "But sometimes apathy overcomes me and I want to give up and accept everything he shared with the girl. They say that human possibilities are limitless, and it's all about desire." Elizabeth looked at the sun and then at Edgar. "I'm studying marketing, but I want to work with people, with the masses. I feel a calling, but I don't know in what way." "That's great," Edgar complimented her. "In time, you'll realize where you're going. And you'll get back on your feet in time. I know you will." Elizabeth smiled and discreetly touched the man's shoulder. Edgar felt the warmth of her hand even through the thick sweatshirt. It remained there, even when the hand itself was gone. They talked and talked about plans and dreams, about the shortcomings of the student dormitories and strict teachers, about the countryside and the city, about the joys of being and imaginary problems. For the first time in many months after the accident, Edgar felt alive. If his legs would have obeyed, he would have run, spreading his arms out to the sides and putting his face to the wind. The pram hit a rock, rattling lightly. When the wheels shuddered, Elizabeth stopped. "Does it hurt?" "No," he looked up at her, bewildered by the sudden joy. "I think I can feel my leg." Her eyes widened, and she squatted down beside him. She grasped her leg just above the knee and pressed lightly. The skin responded to Edgar with a barely perceptible but uncomfortable, dull pain, as if through a pillow. Barely, but it echoed. Edgar grabbed Elizabeth's hand. "I can feel her," he whispered. "I can feel her exactly." Elizabeth jumped up and laughed, then threw her arms around Edgar, a tear running down his cheek, either from joy or happiness, or maybe both. Amanda was dozing in her chair with her headphones on. Michael was sitting next to her, looking at something on his laptop. Clouds flashed in the window. The plane was carrying them home from their holiday. Amanda was pleased, and mostly with herself. She had persuaded her lover abroad to buy some expensive gifts. The arguments were persuasive. "I really need it, and it will be more expensive at our place anyway." Michael didn't argue, but somehow he didn't have the joy of gift-giving on his face. Although Amanda was diligently broadcasting to the entire shop, glowing defiantly and kissing the man on the cheek. Michael himself never started a conversation about moving, despite the fact that the girl did not work, but he occasionally hinted at the need to find a new source of income. Amanda sincerely did not understand these hints, although she pretended to be a fool. In the end, she moved her things to Michael's house and appeared in the flat only occasionally. As the couple rested after the morning flight and drank coffee on the balcony, Amanda glanced again at Michael's second car. "I was thinking that I could drive," she said. "Where to?" Michael looked at her questioningly, taking his eyes off the phone screen and his work correspondence. shopping, errands, fitness, Amanda began to curl her fingers. You can't do much in heels, so in trainers or boots. It's more comfortable. Michael shrugged. And it's easier than buying and registering a car. Why buy a car when you already have one? Amanda nodded down at the blue foreign car. Michael followed her gaze, pressed his lips together, and after a pause said, "The car's not running. I'm waiting for a new engine. Then I was planning to repair it, sell it, and invest the money in a project. And by the way, you don't even have any driving experience." "You can gain experience," Amanda said. "You can always sell it." I liked her so much. I could be your sober driver after all. Amanda was an excellent bargainer. She'd learnt while studying to be a translator that it was easier to ask for something than to make the effort and strain herself. And awkwardness could always be smoothed over with a woman's tricks. So Michael rubbed the bridge of his nose irritably with his fingers. "I don't drink, and even if I did, I could call a taxi. The car's not running, no one can drive it. When the right engine comes along, I'll order it. But until then, you'd better buy yourself a good pair of trainers," he said. The man stood up, took the mug with the rest of the coffee and went back to his room, signaling that the subject was closed. Amanda pouted resentfully. The recommendation seemed insulting to her, considering that pretty shoes and stiletto boots had helped her initially win her lover. She was not refused directly, but rather harshly. She remembered the patient, kind Edgar, who, though he couldn't give her a car, had never refused her other more modest gifts. A few days passed. Amanda decided to ignore Michael's refusal and try to talk about the car again later. She pretended to be a diligent housewife, cooked a nice dinner, bought some good wine. The evening passed in a cozy atmosphere. Until Michael suggested watching a new film that showed the serene life of a family with 2 children. The father was playing frisbee with his son. The mother was teaching her daughter to play the piano. A golden retriever snoozed on the mat. "I always wanted a big family," Michael said suddenly. "A son and a daughter. I even started this business so that the children would have enough to live on and not need anything." Amanda, who was lying on his lap, was slightly shaken, but she did not show it. So there it was, the perfect image of a spouse for Michael, whom he would agree to provide for without question, an educated, working mom. No, she's not going to be that. Wasting her youth and beauty on children, when there are so many countries, so many cool leisure options and ways to improve yourself. "I feel sick," Amanda said, jumping up and going into the kitchen. Suddenly, she had an amazing idea on how to get all the benefits of a lover without cheating on herself. She opened a bottle of mineral water, poured the falling liquid into a glass and drank contentedly. The plan was simple and ingenious. Elizabeth would only come to the village on weekends. For the rest of the time, she had to attend classes. Edgar missed the girl, but tried to keep himself busy in her absence. He was especially focused on writing his book and doing exercises to develop his legs. Elizabeth supported his zeal in both endeavors. In the first 2 weeks of exercise, Edgar was able to wiggle his toes. In another week, he was able to slightly tilt his foot and tense his lower leg. With each new accomplishment, it was as if the motivation and strength for life was returning. May came. Birds sang, tulips, bushes, greenery, and fresh leaves bloomed. Cassandra was digging in the flower bed. She loosened the soil, removed fallen branches from the birch tree where red, yellow, and white tulip buds leaned. Next to them, crocuses climbed out in a row, and at the very border, blue caps of muscari buds. Bill was hanging around the cat, galloped around with his tail between his legs, jumped on the brick walls, hunted for soldier beetles that flew out from under the slate. Edgar sat in the pram by the porch, his eyelids closed, basking in the sun. Suddenly, someone's hands were on his eyelids. "What's the matter?" He stretched out, more amused than annoyed. "Elizabeth, did you think I wouldn't recognize you?" There was a giggle, and then Cassandra's chuckles. "I'm sneaking around like a gorilla," and he's like, "What's the big deal?" Elizabeth indignantly started tickling Edgar's ribs. He laughed immediately, shaking off the remnants of slumber. Cassandra laughed as well, watching the children fool around. When the fun subsided, they went inside to eat cold okroshka and drink dried fruit compote. At the table, Edgar discreetly put his hand on Elizabeth's arm. When his mother was at the cooker, pouring the compote, Elizabeth looked at him embarrassed, but did not remove her hand. Instead, she stroked his little finger with her thumb. It was a strange embarrassment to her normally perky nature. Edgar himself felt like a teenager, as if he were back at the institute and timidly seeking first dates with pretty female classmates. Cassandra saw what was going on at the table out of the corner of her eye, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she thought of something urgent to do outside, grabbed her head, and dashed out of the kitchen. "Elizabeth, I have to talk to you." Edgar began when he realized they were alone. The girl nodded and turned to face him, her whole body on the stool. "About what?" "About what's going on between us." Edgar sighed and took her hand again. "I like you a lot. I realize that we're not just friends anymore. You've become important to me, and you're helping me not to give up. I realize you don't want an invalid, but I'll tell you anyway, I'm married." Yeah, she dumped me like I wasn't worth having around. But officially, I'm still married. Instead of answering, Elizabeth moved closer and hugged him tightly around the neck. "Of course I need you for anything. And I'm sure you'll be out of that damn chair very, very soon," she whispered in his ear. Edgar's insides warmed. He hugged Elizabeth back, at the same time feeling the distinct tingling in his knees again as he pulled her to him. "You are an amazing person, with a good heart and a beautiful dream." Elizabeth looked into his eyes. "And I care first and foremost about how you feel, not what the papers say." The man smiled and hugged the girl again. "Let's get you back on your feet already." Elizabeth kissed him on the cheek. "Everything will work itself out from here." Amanda scrambled out of her seat and ran desperately to the lavatory. Under Michael's surprised gaze, they had just sat down to breakfast Saturday morning. They planned to drive to a business meeting and go for a walk afterwards. "Are you all right?" Michael knocked excitedly on the bathroom door. "Yeah, just dizzy all of a sudden with nausea," Amanda replied, carefully mimicking the appropriate sounds. She made some more noise with the cistern drain, the tap, splashed water on her face, and went out into the corridor. Michael looked at her with a mixture of joy and anticipation. "Are you pregnant?" he blurted out. "Oh, I don't know. I'll take a test today," Amanda clutched her forehead. "What's there to do?" Michael picked her up and sat her on the living room couch, fanning her. "It's pretty clear. You're sick of food and your face is all bloomy. And if that's the case, would you be glad?" Amanda pulled on the most naively righteous expression she could muster. "Are you kidding?" "Of course I am." Michael knelt down in front of her. "I've wanted kids for so long. And I applied for a second degree. What are we going to do? Take it back?" Amanda changed from righteousness to a broken expression. "Why take it back? You're a correspondence student. I'll pay for your education so you can work when the baby grows up," Michael assured her. "Yeah, that's how I went to work." Amanda mentally regained her footing, of course. "Good. I'll go to the doctor tomorrow and find out everything." She sighed, hugging a jubilant Michael. How to fake a pregnancy until the belly appeared. Amanda had thought through the nausea, mood swings, dizziness, and bouts of appetite. It wasn't a problem. A doctor she knew for a fee could write certificates and reports for the first time. But then Amanda was going to stage a miscarriage. The only problem was how to divorce Edgar discreetly, but stay in his flat. After all, the ambitious woman had plans to marry Michael, but he thought the flat belonged to Amanda. He never allowed her to move in. He wouldn't kick his baby mama out on the street, though, would he? There goes the puzzle, thought the cunning Amanda. The certificate was soon obtained. Michael was jubilant, developed a flurry of activity, and was already choosing a name for the future child. He immediately moved Amanda permanently to his place. In the evenings, he looked through prams and cots, endlessly discussed everything related to children. The girl nudged and herself tried to catch the moment to file for divorce. It remained to quietly finish the story with Edgar, so that it would be possible to marry Michael unhindered. There wasn't much time left, and every day counted. In the meantime, Amanda was taking full advantage of her position. She was capricious, demanded a personal masseur, demanded to order food at home, but at 3 o'clock in the morning asked to buy a ring or a handbag. Michael fulfilled all her requests without question, even made a separate bank card for Amanda. After all, the wishes of a mother and her child were a man's law, and no matter what, he liked Amanda, despite her temper. "Are you sure?" Elizabeth looked at Edgar very carefully. "Maybe we should wait. I don't want anything to happen." Yes, I'm sure Edgar leaned on the armrests of his chair as hard as he could. It was time to try it. They were both in the living room of the house, on the carpet. Elizabeth stood beside the pram and held out her arms to the man. Edgar began to carefully stand up. At first his legs obeyed him on his elbows, but somehow sluggishly with a third of the strength that was usual for a healthy man. His knees bent like weighted hinges that hadn't opened a door in a long time. "It's heavy," Edgar muttered. Elizabeth watched the boy eagerly. "It's harder than learning to walk as a child." He put one foot down on the floor first, felt the shaggy pile of the carpet as if through a pillow. Then he put the other foot down. He had to make up his mind and let go of the armrests of the pram. Doubt overwhelmed the mind. Edgar closed his eyes and remembered his first paragliding flight, an eagle around the clouds that hugged the slopes affectionately, overgrown with pines, fir trees. He shivered at the long-forgotten sensations. He felt Elizabeth's support and tried to take a step. His leg felt like a stranger's, stricken with a cramp, but nevertheless he moved slowly forward. A movement, a step through the force, another step. His back was remembering what it was like to be straight. Edgar looked at his legs, scarred from his many extreme activities, and it was as if he was reliving them all a second time, standing here on the soft carpet in his own home. The man managed to take a dozen feeble steps with Elizabeth's encouragement and, tired, sat back in his chair. "You're doing an incredible job," the girl hugged him. "Let's go to the doctor. Let them record your progress. Maybe he will give some recommendations to make the process go faster." "That's a good idea. But how do we get to the city and the hospital?" Edgar nodded sadly at the still-needed wheelchair. "Norman has a car. He can drive it," Elizabeth suggested. "No, he won't, will he?" Edgar waved his hands. "Norman has already done so much for me. I can't. My conscience won't allow it." "Oh, stop it," Elizabeth threw at him. "That grandfather doesn't understand anything. Yeah, he's old and clueless." Edgar was embarrassed. "But only if he agrees, don't insist." He grabbed the palm of Elizabeth's hand, who was about to go to the grandfather. The old Jigalanok drove measuredly over the bumps of the village road. Norman spun the steering wheel and talked about the years of dashing youth and work in the collective farm. Edgar sat in the back seat, holding a folder with his documents. The pram rode in the back in the boot. Elizabeth chortled in the front passenger seat as she listened to her grandfather's stories. It all happened simply, quickly, and completely easy. She asked for it and they drove. At least Edgar had time to call the hospital and find out if the surgeon would see him today. "Well, my dear fellow, you know how to surprise me." The doctor raved about Edgar after the examination. "At this rate, in 6 months you will be able to run." "Really?" Elizabeth, who was also present in the room, couldn't resist asking. "Of course, this is the first time I've seen patients recover so quickly from such injuries. It's a miracle. Although in scientific circles they don't say so." The doctor pointed at Edgar's medical records, then at his legs. "Keep up the exercises. Work on regaining mobility in all parts of his legs. I recommend that you try walking with support." Edgar drove back almost elated. He was confident that very soon he would be able to walk again, but also to fly. It was in this mood that the man received a sudden phone call. "Edgar." Hi, Amanda's voice came through the receiver. "I won't be long. Can you talk?" "Hi. What's wrong?" A lump rose in his chest, and with it came the memories that had almost stopped bothering him. "I filed for divorce," Amanda informed him briefly. "I don't think I need to explain why or why not. You're a big, smart boy. You'll figure it out." "Yes, I will," he confirmed his ex-wife's words. "Good. I hope they do it quickly. I'll be out of the flat in a couple of weeks." Amanda hung up after that. Elizabeth heard the conversation, unlike Edgar. It's for the best. Don't be upset, she turned to Edgar and whispered. You said yourself that she was just a formality. You're right, the man nodded. Still, I loved this man once. The key word is once upon a time. Amanda tapped her fingers contentedly on the arm of the chair. Everything was going according to plan. Edgar had agreed to the divorce, even though he didn't have much of a choice. Michael adored her. The pregnancy legend was confirmed by a certificate. A personal bank card with enough money for every whim at any time of day. Awesome. What more could one want? Amanda felt like a queen, with everyone she'd used in her pursuit of the perfect life dancing in formation in front of her. So what do we have left? Staring pensively at the ceiling, she popped a cherry from the platter on the table. A car and an official marriage, she said to herself, spitting out the pit of the fruit. That's what we'll do tonight. In the evening, when Michael returned home, the first thing he did was to hug Amanda and stroke her belly. The girl was waiting for him. She fed her lover a delicious dinner, poured him wine, and gave him a massage. When Michael relaxed, Amanda went on the attack. Michael, I really want the baby to be born in a legal marriage. I grew up in a full family myself, and I think fatherlessness is unacceptable. I agree too, the man nodded. I wanted to discuss this issue too. Amanda stood waiting, like a hound waiting for the command to hunt down a bird for its master. Instead of answering, Michael reached into the pocket of his briefcase, pulled out a box, and placed it in Amanda's hands. I wanted to make it pretty, but since we're talking, why not? Michael pulled his lover to him, kissing her forehead. I agree, Amanda threw her arms around Michael, admiring the size of the stone in the ring. They decided to get married in 3 months. By the time of the wedding, Amanda had already planned to get rid of her ex-husband. After the ceremony and banquet, a week would pass and she would induce a miscarriage. The trap should slam shut in time and securely. I'll have to put on a few kilos for the good life, the girl smirked, mentally continuing to listen to Michael's musings about the wedding. Surprisingly, he was hardly interested in Amanda's personal life. Before she'd met him, she didn't even remember whether she'd told him about the divorce proceedings or not. Apparently, nonsense like an ex-husband was so insignificant to Michael that he preferred not to spend any time or attention on it. Amanda realized it was time to push harder. Michael, when my belly grows big, it will be hard for me to go to the hospital and to do things. She put her head on her lover's chest. Maybe you'll think about a car. And so I would take a couple of lessons with an instructor to refresh my knowledge in my head. What do you say? Of course, Amanda was lying. She didn't have anything to refresh her mind, because she'd got her license through a big acquaintance and obviously not for free. The young lady was not intimidated by the road, the police, or other drivers. The prestige of owning her own foreign car blinded her eyes. Maybe your words make sense? Michael wondered. He put his hands behind his head and wrinkled his forehead. Amanda held her breath and looked up from under her lashes. All right, he finally announced his decision. Only we're going to do things differently. I'll sell this car and buy you something more feminine, okay? Sure, thanks, honey, Amanda squealed in pleasure and started hugging Michael again, wondering if she should buy a new watch or bracelet in honor of such important events as marriage and the car. You should go into town and get that tramp stuff out of the flat. Cassandra put a plate of hot soup in front of her son. You've been divorced for a fortnight and you still haven't. Outside, the window smelled of lilacs. June was buzzing with young grass and summer rains. The sun was lavishing light on the land. Mum, I'm not quite confident enough to drive myself yet, Edgar replied, opening a jar of sour cream. Over the past month, the man had made noticeable progress in regaining his legs. He could get up and sit down with support, could walk slowly around the house with crutches, walked along the wall without support, and tried to keep his back straight. Could you ask Elizabeth? She goes into town every Monday anyway, if she could help you, the woman advised, sitting down across from him at the table. I don't feel comfortable. She's already here with me all the time, like a carer, Edgar mumbled. Cassandra put her hand on his palm. Son, this girl loves you. Unlike the city girls, you don't blow it. Such girls are worth their weight in gold. The boy looked at his mother in agreement. Edgar realized that everything had been clear between him and Elizabeth for a long time. So why did he hesitate and wait for something? Maybe the proverbial pram was still preventing him from stepping forward, even mentally. Many people have a bad first pancake, but that doesn't mean you can't try again. His mother walked round the table, stroked the back of his head, and went out into the room. Edgar ate his soup, then pulled out his phone and dialed Elizabeth's number. "Hi, I was wondering if you'd go into town with me any day soon and check out the flat." The guy spoke, nervously twirling his spoon. For some reason, every interaction with Elizabeth gave him a pleasant shiver. Edgar was shy, lost, everything fell out of his hands, words were confused. He couldn't remember anything like this with any of his girlfriends. Did it mean what his mother was implying? Edgar didn't know. But each time Edgar waited for Elizabeth to come home from school more and more, and the joy of seeing her was brighter and brighter. "Sure, let's go," the girl agreed. "Are you sure you can manage without the pram?" "I have to," Edgar assured her. "Good," Elizabeth's voice warmed. "Then be ready on Saturday." "I'm looking forward to it." Edgar pressed the button too soon, and he wanted to add kisses. But again, that childish embarrassment ruined it. How surprised he'd be to find Elizabeth feeling the same way, standing in the middle of the institute with a phone in her hand. "I skipped the lab so I could come with you," Elizabeth blurted out when they were already on the train. Edgar looked at her in surprise. He had decided for the first time not to take the wheelchair with him and to use only crutches. "Why?" Instead of answering, Elizabeth climbed under his arm and tucked her nose into his side so that Edgar could only see the top of her head. He smiled into the measured, sleepy emptiness of the carriage, closed his eyes, and hugged Elizabeth tighter. The flat Edgar hadn't been to in almost 6 months echoed with the familiar turn of the key and the smell. The man breathed it in, standing on the threshold as if hesitant to enter. The smell reminded him again of times of traveling and flying. His paraglider was in a case in the cupboard on the balcony, his equipment in a rucksack, trekking boots, a camera for taking pictures from a height, a helmet. Amanda's belongings were not in the flat. Contrary to Cassandra's fears, she had taken every last jar, and judging by the footprints in the bathroom, quite recently. She hadn't even bothered to clean up. Edgar and Elizabeth ordered a snack to be delivered and began to tidy up. The man tried to do everything himself, but occasionally he stopped and rested. Elizabeth quickly tidied up the bathroom, washed the dusty dishes, wiped down the cupboards, vacuumed the carpets, and wiped down the mirrors. "You're doing a great job." She praised Edgar as they sat down in the evening on the sofa in the living room with sandwiches and cups of tea. "The doctor was right. You're getting better." "I'm too well motivated," Edgar joked, glancing at Elizabeth. She was embarrassed and dropped the sausage in her lap. "I'm very grateful for everything you do for me." Edgar took a piece from his sandwich and transferred it to the girl's sandwich. "But I am very much attracted to the sky. I want to fly again and do what I love to do. I just don't know how." Edgar frowned. "Aren't you afraid of hurting your back again?" Elizabeth wrinkled her forehead too. She knew what had happened to Edgar's partner and their plane. "Honestly, I'd go through it all again." Edgar looked at her defiantly. "Why?" Elizabeth bowed her head, perplexed. "To meet you again." Edgar leaned down, quickly pulled the girl to him and kissed her. Amanda hurriedly paced across the bridge to the cafe for lunch with her friend. They had just toured a dozen bridal salons looking for a dress for her and her bridesmaids. It was the end of August, all wedding preparations were almost finished, a restaurant had been chosen, a photographer, a designer, and a host had been hired. The menu was determined and invitations to guests were sent out. "Aren't you tired of pretending to be pregnant while sipping cold juice from a tube?" Judy asked. "I am. But what can you do? You want a beautiful life." Amanda grinned. "You've got Michael, I'll give you that," she said dreamily. "Handsome, with money, established. He's got it all. Not like your former test pilot." "You don't say." Amanda nodded, pushing her plate away. "The man's in his 30s, and he's still in the mountains, doing crazy things. It's all right, they're divorced now. Forgotten like a terrible dream." Her friends laughed. "How far along are you?" Judy nodded at Amanda's belly and grinned. "I'm in my 5th month of eating like a madwoman, and I've already gained 3 kilos. How can I lose it all?" It's okay, one more week and you'll have a tragic drama, Amanda grinned. Where do you get the paperwork from Michael to believe? Judy whispered. Camila, my friend, does it for me for a small fee. Amanda replied in her tone of voice. We should go to her today, by the way. Michael wants the results of the ultrasound. Paul wants to know the baby. She grinned again. You're a brilliant woman, Amanda, she admired her friend. I wouldn't dare do that. If you want to live, you have to be able to move. Amanda shrugged her shoulders. The girls paid for their lunch and said goodbye. Amanda got behind the wheel of a brand new red sedan, and John waited for a taxi. In her head, Amanda was already imagining the wedding ceremony, figuring out how her dress would fit, what angle would be best to take pictures from. She ordered an exclusive bouquet of terry pale lilac roses from the florists and anticipated her image with it in such dreams. The girl drove up to the clinic car park. After a small formalities, Amanda was already sitting in the office of gynecologist Camila. The nice conversation was interrupted by a phone call. Sweetheart, where are you? Michael answered the phone to greet her. I'm at my doctor's office. When I get off, I'll pick up the results and go straight home. Oh great, I thought I'd make risotto. I asked if you could have it, because there's wine in the recipe. Michael asked worriedly. Okay, I'll be sure to ask. Amanda jabbed her finger at the screen without looking and slipped her smartphone into her purse. He's worried about my pregnancy. She wrinkled her nose and made an inverted comma in the air with her fingers. Well, what about you? Camila nodded at the memo for expectant mothers on the office wall. You could really get pregnant, you're already at the right age. And you have a reliable man. As they say, they would have hired a nanny, and you have a child and a status. And you're not poor. What's wrong with that? Amanda wrinkled her nose as if she'd taken a bite out of an unripe persimmon. Are you kidding me? I'm already thinking, how do I lose weight? And if the belly button did grow, there'd be stretch marks, swelling, and a C-section. God forbid. Maybe someday, but definitely not now. It's up to you, but I would not refuse such prospects, Camila grinned. So what do you need? An ultrasound at 16 weeks. I'll look it up. Who I've had recently with the same dates. She sat down at the machine, then back at the computer, and began to look for suitable data. A couple of manipulations to change the date and last name. Soon the required documents were lying in front of Amanda. The girl gratefully slipped them into her bag and moved an envelope to Camila. Have you decided what to wear to the wedding? She asked. Yes, I've looked at a couple of options, the doctor replied. We were discussing your photos. General laughter resounded in the office. Amanda drove home in high spirits. She picked up the wedding glasses from the salon, packed them carefully in a box, and was pulling into the car park of Michael's house by 7 p.m. That's odd. I thought he wanted to make risotto. Amanda turned up her nose, kicking off her shoes in the hallway. The house smelled ordinary instead of Italian. And it was too quiet, no sound of rattling pots, no clatter of knives from the kitchen. The girl went into the hall and saw Michael sitting in the armchair. Did you decide to order food from the restaurant? Amanda tried to joke. Michael looked at her glumly. Give me the car keys. Why? Amanda raised an eyebrow in bewilderment. Michael sucked in air through his nose, exhaled. You're going to give me the car keys, then you're going to go to the first floor. Gather all your things, call a taxi, and get the hell out of my life. His voice rumbled so loudly that it echoed in every corner of the house. Amanda squirmed cowardly, her eyes watering. She tried to open her mouth. Michael, what's wrong? The man stood up and roughly snatched the keys from her, his hands shaking. And tell your doctor I'll make sure she's not allowed to practice medicine. Or better yet, sue her, Michael said coldly, looking her in the eye. Amanda collapsed onto the carpet between the chairs. Her ears rang in her ears as reality rained down on her unprotected skin, burning her with the pain of hot needles. Michael squatted down beside her, took her chin, and turned her to face him. Were you trying to get a warm place for yourself at my expense? I had the wrong time and made the wrong call. Ay-yi-yi-yi-yi. How embarrassing. It was so stupid. To think of it, he said with a sneer. Amanda burst into tears of shame. But Michael didn't care anymore. She remembered that night like a blur. She stuffed her things into suitcases and bags in 15 minutes, not even trying to apologize, even though it was pointless. Offended Michael, the director of the real estate agency, made caustic jokes about her, and then he poured himself a glass of wine and drank in silence, watching her ex-lover Amanda frantically packing her belongings. Before he left, he took away all her expensive gifts, watches, jewelry, branded items. Amanda walked out of the gate with exactly the same set of things she'd come here with a few months ago. "So are you ready?" Elizabeth stood in front of Edgar and held his hands tightly. "Ready, my captain," the man mockingly put a hand to his helmeted head. The paraglider takeoff pad spread out before them, and beyond it thundered mountains of unbelievable beauty in the autumn landscape. The slopes were drenched in all the colors of the sun's palette, from ochre to purple. The bushes of wild buckthorn shone with beads of miniature berries. Black thorns did not argue with them with their purple cherry leaves. Gray-brown stones, as if old wise men, soothed the riot of autumn colors. It was the end of September. On the bald slope away from the site, the last emerald lizards basked and rare butterflies fluttered. "When you go to land, don't spread your legs too far apart. We'll know when it's time," said Terence, adjusting his harness. "Oh, come on. What's the holdup?" Thomas, the instructor who had once trained John, peered out from behind the passenger cradle. "He won't be flying himself until next season at the earliest. I'm in charge for now." All right, stay out of this." Terence held his palms up and moved away from the runway with Elizabeth. "Let's go down the incline and I'll pick you up," Thomas commanded John. "Let's go." John gripped the safety harness tighter and sped forward. Elizabeth gasped when the wind caught the glider and it began to rise upwards, swaying weakly. Terence put his palm to his forehead, shielding his eyes from the sun, and shouted approval. "All right, let's go," Elizabeth agreed. "Good. I'm worried about him anyway." She rubbed her fingers together nervously. "Come on," Terence patted her on the shoulder. "Thomas is the best of the best. He'll bring your husband back to Earth safe and sound." Elizabeth just looked up at the bright dome of the paraglider, which had already risen even higher. "Let's go to the lower ground." "They'll land there," Terence nodded to the gangway. "When will you fly?" she asked. "I'll wait until Edgar is fully recovered," Elizabeth replied. "He's the only one I trust. And it's so nice and amazing and beautiful here." She spread her arms and breathed in the still warm, clean air, but with a hint of autumn chill. Terence laughed. "You haven't been rafting with us or riding quad bikes in the mud. There you can feel all the charms of wild tourism." "I think that everything is still ahead of us," Elizabeth smiled back. "Of course, we will definitely take you with us if you want. First we'll get to work, and then we'll send one on tour with people," laughed the cheerful Terence again. No. I'm only going with my husband." Elizabeth shook her head. They walked to the lower ground, where they found a thermos of herbal tea and sandwiches in the tents. A lot had changed in Edgar and Elizabeth's lives over the past summer. They sold their flat in the city and bought a smaller place away from the center. And the remaining money was spent on a second-hand minibus in good condition. Terence did not have to be persuaded for a long time. He was happy to return to the company and to travel to the mountains again. He only demanded a good insurance policy in case of unforeseen circumstances. Elizabeth took over the information part of the company, dealing with advertising, answering the phone and keeping the documentation. Edgar was not yet able to fly as an instructor. He had not yet fully recovered from his injury. But he was happy to tell tourists about the coolest places to visit, gave a copy of his book with an autograph to the most curious. But the biggest change was in Elizabeth and Edgar's relationship. They were now officially married. There was no lavish wedding, no expensive gifts, no typical wedding dress. The newlyweds signed, sat with their loved ones, and drove off to the mountains that same evening. By the time of the wedding, Edgar was already walking with a cane and did not need crutches, much less a wheelchair. The doctors applauded him and called it nothing short of a miracle. "It's so good to be here again," and to have everything back to the way it was. Terence stretched noisily with a satisfied face. Almost the same old Elizabeth corrected him. "I'm sorry," generously. Terence made a conciliatory gesture with his hand. Suddenly Edgar's phone, which was still in Terence's pocket, caught the connection and played a familiar tune, announcing an incoming call. "No, it's not Edgar. He's flying." Terence deftly retrieved the device and put it to his ear, winking at Elizabeth, who was listening intently to the dialogue. "How does it fly?" "Just like that. He's recovered. So I think the question is irrelevant. He's already married and loves her very much." Terence put the phone back away. "Who was that?" Elizabeth asked curiously. There's a fallen star." Terence waved his hand vaguely in the direction. Suddenly he jumped up and shouted, They're flying. Catch it." Elizabeth jumped up after Terence. The two of them, assisted by Thomas, brought Edgar safely back to solid ground. He was unhooked from the cradle, and the man was sprawled on the grass, arms outstretched, looking up at the autumn blue sky with sparse clouds. "Alive?" Elizabeth asked with a laugh. "As alive as I've ever been," Edgar blurted out, putting his hands behind his head.